I understand that the Metropolitan Police have now confirmed that 2 men were arrested in March on suspicion of offences relating to espionage and that they are on police bail until early October. As you know, we do not discuss the details of security issues on the floor of the House for reasons which are well understood. This is an ongoing, sensitive investigation, and members will of course understand that public discussion will be wholly inappropriate. However, I want to reassure members that the House follows the same vetting procedures as the Government, that issues raised by media stories are being addressed and that the security is working closely and effectively with other relevant authorities. We keep our security arrangements under review at all times in order to deal with the evolving threats. The extreme small number of people who needed to know were immediately briefed on a strictly confidential basis, given the national security of this sensitive matter. At this stage, I do not wish to say anything further about this issue, and I would remind all members the importance of not discussing security issues on the floor of the House. That is particularly important in this case. We're commenting on identities of those alleged to be involved, engaging in speculation about the case, or discussing other details runs a serious risk of prejudicing any future prosecutions, which the comments made in the media were unhelpful, something for which I am sure no member will want to be responsible. I do not intend to take any points of order on this matter. If members have security concerns, they are of course welcome to raise them outside of this chamber with me or with the House Securities professionals, or both. Right, let us move on. Order, order, Simon Hart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that on the 14th day of September 2023, Mr. Speaker, do issue as warrant to the Clerk of the Crown to make out a new writ for the electing of a member to serve in this present Parliament for the county constituency of Tamworth in the room of Christopher John Pincher, who, since his election for the said county constituency, has been appointed to the office of Steward and Bailiff of His Majesty's Manor of Northstead in the county of York.
The question is that on the 14th day of September 2023, I do issue my warrant to the Clerk of the Crown to make out a new writ for the electing of a member to serve in this present Parliament for the county constituency of Tamworth in the room of Christopher John Pincher, who since his election for the said county constituency has been appointed to the office of Steward and Bailiff of His Majesty's Manor of Northstead in the county of York. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Are we sorted, Dr. Benjer? Very good. I think we had a little security issue down below. Right, let us come to questions. Secretary of State for Defence. We start with Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Question number 1, please.
Just let people, yeah. Okay. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the thoughts and prayers of the whole House will be with the Secretary of State and his family during sitting Shiva. Mr. Speaker, it's right that we record here today the anniversary of 9/11, a terrible act that changed our world. The UK is standing with the Kingdom of Morocco. We are engaged on the ground already and stand by to help in any way that we can. Defence recognises the need to evolve so that we can continue to attract and retain the very best. To that end, Defence commissioned the Haythornthwaite Review into Armed Forces Incentivisation, which was published in June. I'll respond formally on behalf of the Department in the coming months, but Defence is supportive of the recommendations. On retirement age, I have committed to work with officials and the single services to review rigid cut-offs and to consider establishing an assessment framework to be used on a case-by-case basis.
Christian Charlie.
Thank you very much. Can I associate myself with the early remarks of the Minister? And I would thank him for his answer. As he is aware, this is an issue which I've already taken interest in and written to. And I had a constituent who came to me recently who has spent a good number of years in the armed forces and is very proud of what he has given to keep our country safe, but concerned that the armed forces, particularly the army, is losing institutional memory. And so specifically with reservists, the cut-off age of 55 he feels is too young. and certainly for roles which are perhaps more administrative. And I wonder if the Ministry could take this into account in the review and perhaps consider allowing reservists to stay longer in those roles.
Mr. Speaker, I really have to declare my interest at this point, as I'm in my 63rd year and I remain a reservist. I am sympathetic to the points the Honourable Lady makes, and we will certainly factor them into our review.
The Secretary of State, John Healey.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Defence Secretary is with his close family today, and we, on this side, extend our deepest condolences. I also offer him our warmest congratulations. Over the years and in different roles, I've shadowed him and he's shadowed me, and we both know that the first duty of any government is to keep the country safe, and I will always look to work with him on that basis in this new job. On personnel, Mr. Speaker, levels of satisfaction with service life have plunged a third over the last 13 years. What's the plan to lift these record low levels of military morale?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he paints an overly gloomy picture of life in the armed forces. For most people, it's a rewarding career, and they take with them the skills they need into civilian life and prosper. However, we are aware of our need to compete in the workplace in the years ahead, and to that end we have commissioned Rick Haythornthwaite, for his review, which we broadly agree with and will respond to very soon.
SNP spokesperson, can I welcome Martin Docker to use?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me also associate these benches with the words of the Minister for the Secretary of State at this sad time, and also for Morocco and for all those New Yorkers who are remembering today. We know that the cost of living crisis is one which is affecting us all equally, and the Minister has had some fine words there, but we know his party is often in an inverse relationship with the rhetoric and action with our personnel. So can the Minister tell the House and members of the armed forces what his government is going to be doing to remedy the shameful reality of an armed forces personnel being given the lowest pay rise among public servants, a paltry 5%?
I think the Honourable Gentleman may be in error. The lowest paid members of our armed forces were awarded 9.7% by the Armed Forces Pay Review Body, a recommendation which we accepted in full. Seniors got 5.8%, and those of two-star rank and above got 5.5%. That will give the best pay award to the least well paid in our armed forces.
Martin Docker to use.
We'll disagree in the numbers, Mr. Speaker, because let's talk about the rhetoric from the Right Honourable Jim, because unless his government is willing to deal with pay and housing conditions for armed forces properly. Now, as the armed forces personnel leave the forces for better paid jobs, could it not be time to consider the reason the police were able to secure an almost 50% higher pay rise than our other uniformed public servants? Was it because they have a statutory body to represent them in dealing with the government, and why doesn't his government support that action?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman has ignored what I've just been saying. He also didn't make reference, of course, to the freezing of accommodation charges, the freezing of food charges, wraparound childcare, and a whole raft of measures that we have introduced in order to help with the cost of living crisis.
Public courts.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Royal Air Force pilots and ground crew are poised on quick reaction alerts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round, ready to scramble within minutes. And the Honourable Gentleman would point out quickly that it would be remiss to say that that is solely the endeavour of fast jet pilots. Equally poised are those in his own constituency who crew the tankers that must also deploy rapidly to support. QRA has been launched on 5 occasions in 2023, with every incident resolved successfully.
Public courts.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for his kind words about my constituents, but he will no doubt have read the Commons Defence Select Committee's report Winging It on aviation procurement, and it warns of an unacceptable gap in combat air mass. Now, with the retirement of the Hercules placing even more demands upon the Air Mobility Force and the Voyagers he quite rightly pays tribute to being asked to do more and more each month, what confidence does he have that if required to do so, those forces have enough men, women and machines to defend the UK in a peer conflict?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have complete confidence that Quick Reaction Alert will be resourced. It is the highest priority of the Air Force to defend the homeland. I also have complete confidence that the Combat Air Force, as currently structured, is capable of performing a very wide range of duties around the world, and I pay tribute to the work of the Air and Space Commander and his team, who through work on agile deployment are finding that we can deploy Typhoon and F-35 ever more quickly to ever more austere operating environments, and that drives the productivity of the force even further.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's of course no question over the quality of combat air crews, but there is a big question mark over the quantity of aircraft that they can fly. And I want to challenge the Minister on his confidence that he's just articulated, because there's serious concerns that our combat air crew are engaged almost universally in transit and air policing and have very little aircraft availability to practice proper combat air. What's his assessment of that concern?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we take very seriously the work that the Defence Select Committee does and enjoy reading their reports, and as I hope members of the committee in the House would recognise, very often take their findings into policy. But I do push back gently, because in addition to the incredible work of QRA and the support that the Royal Air Force has given to NATO missions over the last 18 months since the start of the war in Ukraine, they have also been able to support carrier strike deployments, deployment on exercise Red Flag, and indeed the deployment of a below squadron in strength all the way across to Australia, getting to exactly what I said to the honourable friend from Witney, that this ability to deploy the Air Force with greater agility further from home in more austere settings is a step change for the Royal Air Force, allowing it to operate from more austere environments rather than solely from its home bases.
Mr. Brandon Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 4, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The latest estimates suggest that MOD investment supports over 200,000 jobs in industries across the UK. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the best way we can keep growing the numbers of jobs in defence is to back the British defence industry, which is why I am delighted to confirm that this week in London we are hosting the biggest ever DSEI, showcasing the very best of the British defence industry, companies large and small. And we should remember, Mr. Speaker, they not only provide prosperity in every part of our country, but they provide us with the means we have to defend ourselves in an increasingly contested world.
Mr. Brandon Sharma.
The Defence Secretary's predecessor rightly prioritised British jobs over buying off the shelf from America. But the Times recently exposed a difference of opinion with the Prime Minister, who insisted on buying American helicopters. Can the Secretary of State assure the House that he will stand up for the British jobs and R&D, or is our only hope to replace him with the Right Honourable Member of Wentworth and Dean?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's an ongoing debate in procurement, as has been the case for many years. The difference between buying off the shelf, as the honourable gentleman says, and also having our own sovereign capability. The fact is, until we brought out DCIS in 2021, arguably the default position of the MOD was to go primarily for value for money. But actually, since DCIS, we have a more flexible and balanced approach, which we've seen in many specific procurements where we do give much greater weighting to social value, to local content, and this has been illustrated on many procurements because, above all, we do want to support British jobs and having our own sovereign capability.
Thank you, sir. My condolences, please, to the Secretary of State. Babcock are one of the largest defence employers in the country. But as reported in the Sunday press, their record on refits of surface ships is woeful. It took them over 4 years to refit the Type 23 frigate HMS Iron Duke. But on submarines, it's even worse. 7 years to refit a Trident boat. According to the journal Navy Lookout, which said this online, so presumably the Russians and the Chinese could have read it, a few weeks ago, not a single one of our attacked submarines was at sea. They were all tied up alongside. This is deeply embarrassing to the Department and to the Royal Navy, whose admirals are tearing their hair out. It's Babcock's fault. So will ministers get the senior directors of Babcock into the Department for an interview without coffee and ask them to raise their game for the benefit of the Navy and the defence of the realm?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I have the greatest respect for him. He will appreciate we do not comment on the operational availability of submarines. This is a particularly sensitive matter. However, he is absolutely right that we do need to focus on the time it's taking to bring ships and all aspects of our fleet back into service. I can confirm to him I do engage regularly with Babcock, and I will be visiting Devonport very soon.
Can I welcome the Shadow Minister, Maria Reid?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The government's wasted £15 billion through mismanagement of defence procurement whilst failing to deliver vital equipment and overseeing the loss of 30,000 highly skilled jobs in the defence and aerospace industry since 2010. So does he accept that preventing another 13 years of Tory failure is key to increasing the number of UK-based jobs in the defence sector, backing British industry and British military resilience?
Well, I'm grateful, I welcome her to her new position, as I believe is my shadow. All I would say, Mr. Speaker, is we are very proud of our record, because what we've been faced with in the last year or so has been this war on our doorstep in Europe, where procurement has risen to the occasion. DNS in Abbey Wood have delivered kit out to Ukraine in record speed. We've seen acquisitions such as of the Archer on a quick basis to fit our requirements, but I can absolutely confirm we are committed to maximising the number of jobs that come from our procurement whilst ensuring balance that with giving our armed forces the best possible capability.
Thank you, through.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I should like to answer questions number 5 and 11 together. The MOD delivers a range of services to veterans and their families. This includes the administration and payment of armed forces pensions and compensation and tailored advice and assistance through the Veterans Welfare Service, Defence Transition Service and the Integrated Personal Commissioning for Veterans. The independent review of these services was published in July, and we will respond in full to the recommendations later this year.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last October, my constituent, a disabled veteran who served with distinction in both Afghanistan and Iraq, applied to the war pensions and the Armed Forces compensation schemes. Despite supplying all the information that's required and medical evidence, he's still waiting for determination of his case almost 12 months on. Will my honourable friend look into this case as a matter of urgency and carry out a review into the waiting times for these schemes to make sure nobody else has to wait such a long time to get their due rewards?
I do thank my honourable friend. If she's able to provide further details of the specific case, I'd be very happy to investigate. The latest Armed Forces Compensation Scheme Quinquennial Review was published on the 17th of July 2023. It aims to ensure that the scheme remains fit for purpose and identify opportunities for improvement of the sort that my honourable friend has highlighted. Its recommendations are being considered at the moment. I think timeliness is foremost amongst them, and a government response will be published later this year.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, British Legion's recent report showed that only 8% of disabled veterans applying for employment support allowance had their service medical records considered in their work capability assessment. And I do want to extend my condolences to the Defence Secretary, but what discussions has he had with the Work and Pensions Secretary on this and on disregarding all military compensation awards for means-tested and income-based assessments such as housing benefit?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Obviously, these conversations are live in the context of the work I have just been describing. We'll take her points into account. They're ones that have been made by several in the defence and veterans community, and I know people feel very strongly about it. Ultimately, of course, it's a matter for DWP and the Treasury.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, this House as a whole provides vociferous support for our veterans of all kinds, particularly through the mechanism of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Armed Forces. And perhaps can I take this opportunity of paying tribute to Miss Amy Swash, who has run the APG for me now for 8 years, but who sadly leaves us shortly for other jobs. But can I just thank her for all the work she's done for a superb amount of time, particularly raising the plight of veterans.
Yes, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right, and I add to his tributes my own, and can I also say my admiration for the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, which I think does a fantastic job in informing and educating colleagues.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In July, the government published a review of the treatment of LGBTQ+ veterans. The previous Secretary of State's response to that won him many plaudits, and his reaction was welcomed, but he did say he was going to take his time in order to make sure he got things right. But I just wonder if the Minister could give us an update on when we can expect a response to the recommendations.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's right to raise this. At the time I said the community should allow us time, but not too much time, and I'm very sure that they will hold us to that. We will respond in full to the large number of recommendations, but we're broadly supportive of Lord Etherton's work. There is much in it that we would utterly agree with, plus some as well that we would like to add in the way of changes for the future.
Shadow Minister Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on that theme, the loss of livelihoods and long-term suffering endured by LGBT+ veterans due to the cruel and unjust ban on homosexuality in the armed forces has been enormous. And we welcome the Etherton review into the ban and its recommendations, which represent the beginning of a long overdue healing process. The Secretary of State's predecessor promised that the government would provide a full response to the review's recommendations after summer recess, which the House would have an opportunity to debate. So will the Minister confirm when the government will respond to the report's recommendations and that the House will still be provided time to debate it?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady. Clearly, we will be debating this at some length. I hope the House, when it sees the government response to Lord Etherton's recommendations, will be pleased with what they see. At the moment, we're working with the community, with Fighting for Pride in particular, to ensure that what we put in place is right and that it's acceptable to those who have been done down by the events of 1967 to 2000.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Bear with me, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that the nuclear test medal is now in production, and we are ensuring that as many as possible of the over 2,000 veterans and families who have applied for the medal will have it in time for this year's remembrance events.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister will know that I take an interest in the veterans issue and declare an interest as the President of Hinckley's Royal British Legion. And to that end, a constituent, Alfred Roy Davenport, served in the RAF medical team from November 56 to November 59, stationed on Christmas Island. Now, he's 85 and concerned about the delay that's been in the award of these nuclear veteran medals. So can my right honourable friend confirm that all veterans will have these awards so that they can have them ready for Remembrance Sunday, so that our servicemen and women can be congratulated and recognised for all their service?
Thank my honourable friend. As my right honourable friend, the Veterans Minister, stated in the House on the 7th of September, the government is doing everything possible to ensure that as many nuclear test veterans as possible receive their medals in time for Remembrance Sunday, and I appreciate the importance of that. A presentation event to award the first medals is actively being considered by the Office for Veterans Affairs, but it is a balance between issuing the medals for Remembrance Sunday whilst ensuring that medals are awarded in an appropriate manner to this cohort.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a written question to the Minister, I asked whether any files have been removed from the MOD's health records of nuclear test veterans. He assured me that the department was not aware of any removal, but many nuclear veterans continue to report finding large gaps when requesting their medical records. So could the Minister clarify, therefore, if the files have not been removed, how nuclear veterans and their families can gain full access to them?
Thank the honourable lady. They will need to apply through a subject access request. I reiterate what I said to her in my answer to her question. We, of course, do everything we can to locate records when people request them, and I can assure her that we could find none on this occasion.
Chilmore.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I should like to answer questions 7, 13, 18, 19, 20 and 23 together. The Ministry of Defence's priority remains the relocation of Arab-eligible Afghans to the safety of third countries at best pace. His Majesty's Government continues to accommodate and support Arab-eligible people in third countries while they await relocation to the United Kingdom.
Chilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am proud to have an Afghan interpreter for the British Armed Forces as a constituent, but I was ashamed to learn from him that his brother, who worked for 6 years directly for the SAS in Helmand province, had applied under the Arab scheme and had been rejected without a proper explanation. He's now in hiding in Afghanistan. Would the Minister take up his case as a matter of urgency, and would he explain to the House why his government is still failing to support those Afghans who risked so much to support our armed forces?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady mentions a very specific role that it would be inappropriate to speculate over on the floor of the House and, of course, look at the particular case she mentions. But it is worth just reminding to Right Honourable colleagues around the House that the Arab scheme was intended for those who had been in direct support of the UK military, interpreters most often, and there is a very narrow opportunity beyond for those with special circumstances who have come through under Category 4. And it's quite often the case when colleagues write to the Ministry of Defence to raise a case that they do so on behalf of somebody who might have served in the Afghan National Security Forces, not necessarily in the direct employ of the UK military. Now, that is to cast no judgment on the case she raises. I'll look at that specifically and write to her.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a real deep sense of injustice amongst former serving officers and other military personnel that we've actually forgotten this moral obligation, really, to those Afghan military personnel and others who served alongside us. So will he confirm just how many Afghans, former military personnel, are presenting as homeless currently in the UK? And secondly, will he confirm just how many are currently in hotels in Pakistan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems that my initial reply might have been quite useful, but the Honourable Gentleman may not have heard or understood it. ARAP is not explicitly for those who served in the Afghan armed forces alongside the British military. It is for those who served in the employ of the British military in all but a very narrow number of cases. I'll write to him with the precise question he asked about Afghan service personnel now homeless in the UK. I suspect it will be remarkably few, but Afghan service personnel are not the main target of ARAP. And as someone who served in Afghanistan, I share the sense that many of my colleagues, former colleagues, have, that they would like to have done more, but it was simply never what ARAP was designed to do, nor is it credible that the hundreds of thousands of people who served in the Afghan National Forces could all be relocated to the UK.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2021, I held a public meeting shortly after the evacuation from Afghanistan. This was widely attended by worried and distressed residents, all wanting help for their relatives. Desperate situations in Afghanistan. It's now been over 2 years and there are still huge problems with ARAP. Can the Minister say why they're allowing people and their relatives to suffer for so long?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a known number of people who worked in the employ of the British military during our campaign in Afghanistan, and our priority has been to work through those lists and to match the lists of people we know to have worked for us with those who are applicants. And actually, it's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that there are only about 2,000 applications outstanding, and in the last 2 months alone, 58,000 decisions have been taken. Overwhelmingly, those, I'm afraid, are to say no to people, but we are making good progress and are nearing the end of tracking down all of those we know to have worked for us.
Catherine West.
Mr. Speaker, could I return to the question raised by my colleague from Warwick and Leamington? How many applicants are still being kicked out of hotels in the UK? How many applicants are applying from Pakistan and in hiding?
Well, the honourable gentleman from Warwick asked a very particular question about Afghan service personnel. That was his question that I think the record will show, and I answered that, but I'll obviously need to go away and confirm, because that's not something that ARAP is intended to meet, and we'll need to see if we can find those statistics. She asked how many have been removed from hotels. Well, the plan is to remove all ARAP applicants from hotels, because ARAP applicants are not here illegally. They have not arrived on boats across the channel. They are entitled to be here. They have access to full universal credit and housing benefit, and much more importantly, have the right to work immediately on arrival. And so our priority, unapologetically, and I would hope the Honourable Lady would agree that this is the right approach, is to get people out of hotels and into houses where they can get on with the life they so deserve here in the UK as legal citizens.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's hardly in the spirit of Operation Warm Welcome that, as the second anniversary of the evacuation of Kabul passed, Afghans who supported our armed forces were still left crowded into hotels at the taxpayers' expense, or expected to move hundreds of miles from where they have managed to find employment and their children have settled into schools. So when does the Minister now expect all Afghans in the schemes to be moved out of hotels and given suitable offers of accommodation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree actually with the Honourable Lady, and her question stands in contrast with the previous one, because her question was about the need to get people out of hotels, not suggesting that they should somehow be staying there. The Minister for Veterans Affairs has been leading on this task around government. Few in this House have more emotional energy to drive that mission. He sees it as of huge importance that people are moved out of hotels and allowed to get on with their lives as quickly as possible. I will ask his office to write to her with the exact detail of when he hopes to see the job done.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend to the Defence team and indeed the House the new book by Larissa Brown, The Gardener of Lashkar, which outlines in great detail the sort of debt we owe to the people who tried to help our forces. My specific question is this, not about people serving with the Afghan forces, but do we have a proper database of all those who did serve with the British forces, who are eligible under the scheme, and can he guarantee that the scheme will not be closed while some of them, probably a large number of them, are still in hiding in Afghanistan and are thus unable to apply for it?
Mr. Speaker, it won't surprise the Right Honourable Gentleman to know that the lists of people who worked for the British Armed Forces over our extended period in Afghanistan came onto many different lists, and part of the job of work of the last 18 months or so has been to consolidate that into an authoritative list of those that we know to have worked for us. But we do have very good records, as you would expect the military to have kept. That allows us to focus our search for people that we know to be eligible within the pile of applications, and of late to make rapid progress in informing those who are uneligible that they are not eligible. We will, of course, keep the scheme open for as long as it takes to find all of those that we know work for us.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his considered remarks, and will he join me in thanking both Colchester City Council and Essex County Council for their work in supporting many Afghan nationals locally who have been in hotels since last autumn. They've aided them to get into housing. However, we do still have 6 families and 40 individuals who need to be supported in temporary accommodation. So can the Minister, I think, give assurances to the House about the cross-government work that has taken place to ensure that they come out of hotels and that they become settled, and in particular the work that his department is leading on involving helping to get Afghans into employment so that they can settle into the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely give my right honourable friend the assurance that she asks for. She knows better than anybody, given her previous role in government, that these men and women who have come have every legal right to start to work and to settle in the UK. They have deserved their journey here on the back of what they did in support of our armed forces in the UK, and so whilst they are in hotels, we will support them, but better still, once we've got them settled in more permanent accommodation, we will support them into employment, and I'll make sure the Minister for Veterans Affairs briefs her on his work on that matter.
Valerie Vars.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, our commitment to NATO is unwavering. We have strengthened our force posture in Estonia, stationed a light cavalry squadron in Poland, provided the NATO mission in Kosovo with personnel, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, and provided specialist personnel to the NATO mission in Iraq. The national flagship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, sailed over the weekend and will shortly fly the NATO flag as the NATO flagship whilst on operations in the Euro-Atlantic. We contribute to every NATO mission, declare our nuclear deterrent to NATO, and consistently spend at least 2% of gross domestic product on defence. We will maintain our leading position in NATO over the decades ahead.
Mr. Speaker, can I place on record my condolences to the current Defence Secretary and my thanks to the former Defence Secretary, and we wish him well in whatever he undertakes to do. Thank the Minister for his full response. He will know that NATO's obligations are to work with partners. So can he say what discussions he's had with his counterparts in NATO about working with the African Union to ensure stability and security in that region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as colleagues have rightly offered their condolences to the new Secretary of State and remarked on the anniversary of 9/11, the thing that maybe has fallen through the cracks is for us to send our regards to the former Secretary of State, with whom I had the great pleasure of working for 3.5 years. His effort and contribution to defence was quite extraordinary, and I think he will be remembered in history as one of the great Secretaries of State, and he should be very proud of everything that he achieved. The Honourable Lady is absolutely right that NATO's southern flank, Africa, is of enormous importance to Europe and the security of the Euro-Atlantic. It won't surprise her to know that in the wake of the coups over the summer in both Niger and Gabon, conversation between European defence ministers, NATO defence ministers, has been regular and urgent as people seek to understand what the response could be. It doesn't look like it is one in which NATO would be to the fore, but it is clearly in NATO's interests that a European response in Africa to these coups is forthcoming.
Speaker, my condolences to the Secretary of State. As my honourable friend knows, membership of NATO requires an expenditure of 2% of GDP. This is an arbitrary and paltry figure, bearing in mind the threats that we all face. What discussions is he having with other NATO partners, many of whom are not even spending the 2%, to raise the increase or to increase their spending on defence?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I steer my honourable friend to the communique from the Vilnius summit, which was very clear that NATO countries that aren't yet spending 2% need to urgently increase their spending to do so. Our Prime Minister has gone further and indicated his willingness to spend 2.5% on defence once the economic circumstances allow. And I think that that is the right order, because you cannot have physical security without economic security.
Shadow Minister Luke Popper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 13 years of Tory army cuts, serious and senior military figures are now questioning the UK's ability to deliver our NATO obligations. And while NATO is boosting the size of its high readiness forces from 40,000 to 300,000 following Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, UK ministers plan to further cut the army to its smallest since the Napoleonic era. Mr. Speaker, the last Conservative Defence Secretary told this House that the government had hollowed out and underfunded our armed forces. Is that still the position of the Ministry of Defence? And will the Tory army cuts still be forced through by this latest set of ministers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the former Secretary of State's comment, which the Shadow Minister conveniently quotes in a limited way, was that successive governments had failed to invest in the enablers that underpinned our warfighting capability. It is to the credit of this Prime Minister and the two Conservative Prime Ministers that went before him that the commitments have been made to grow our defence budgets, including under Prime Minister Johnson a £19 billion increase to defence budget, and under Prime Minister Sunak another £5 billion in the last year or so. That also ignores that when he says that NATO is increasing its rapid reaction force, that doesn't mean that around NATO armies are growing. It just means that the armies around NATO are committing ever more of the forces that they have to NATO's high readiness formations. The British Army is to the fore in that.
David Simmons.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I said in May to the House that we aim to process all outstanding initial applications by the end of August. I can report that we have just 2,000 complex cases remaining of over 93,000 principal applications that we received. We have issued over 58,000 decisions to applicants in the past 3 months, giving them the clarity they deserve. We continue to move at best pace to process the remaining applications.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank my honourable friend and his ministerial colleagues for the work done over the summer, including with Hillingdon and Harrow councils in my constituency, on support for those who've served in support of our armed forces. Will he commit to work in future, as Afghan bridging operations come to a close, to work with local authorities to ensure that those who have put their lives on the line supporting our military operations continue to be supported in their new lives here in the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly can.
Jones.
Minister what liaising has with the Home Office. I have a Afghan Special Forces interpreter who came here and did valiant work during Op Pitting. His mother, father and siblings then left Afghanistan and ended up in Ukraine of all places. They then have moved to the UK last year. The Home Office gave them temporary leave to remain, only then to receive a letter this last couple of months saying that would either have to be deported back to Afghanistan, Ukraine or to Rwanda. Now, in this case, I interceded and his office have actually helped. What is the actual going on here between his department and the Home Office?
Well, Mr. Speaker, just from the question, I can see all sorts of ways in which this might present quite a confusing case to colleagues in the Home Office, especially if those who are in Ukraine proceeded to the UK under a mechanism other than ARAP. Can I look at the detail of the case and come back to him rather than speculate?
Oh, lovely. Emma Hardy.
Speaker, question number 13.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government continues to invest significant sums to improve the quality of UK service family accommodation. £337 million was invested over financial years 2021 and 21-22 combined, and £163 million in 22-23. The forecast for this financial year is £312 million.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ofsted's Chief Inspector Amanda Spielman has repeatedly said that she has, quote, deep concerns about the, quote, continued failures to improve service accommodation for armed forces recruits over the past 7 years. So can the Minister explain why these concerns from the neutral Ofsted Inspector Amanda Spielman have fallen on deaf ears, and why the improvements are still yet to be made?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. It is an extremely important subject. We do care immensely about improving our estate. They don't fall on deaf ears, Mr. Speaker. If that was the case, we would not have put on the table a further £400 million for SFA in the Defence Command Paper Refresh, and it's precisely because of that additional funding that this year our spend will be almost double last year.
Edward Lee. The Prime Minister said he was going to lead by example. And when it came to the military base at Catterick, he was going to ensure that illegal migrants were housed there. We now understand that the generals have said they don't want a bunch of Afghans and Iraqis next to their squaddies, so nothing is happening with regard to illegal migrants being put there, although the MOD is so determined that their soldiers should not be placed near migrants that they are moving them out of RAF Scampton. So when are illegal migrants going to be placed in Catterick as promised by the Prime Minister? I want a date and I want it now.
Well, I say to my honourable friend, I visited Catterick on Friday. I discussed precisely this matter with senior members of the armed forces based at Catterick. The characterisation he uses is, I have to tell him, not correct. These matters are being considered objectively and carefully, but that work is ongoing, Mr. Speaker.
Ongoing, yes.
Helen Morgan. Thank you, Mr. Edmund.
Question 14, please, Mr. Speaker.
The Defence Infrastructure Organisation provides additional needs and disability adaptations to service family accommodation. These provide changes to SFA to meet the family's needs as set out by a suitably qualified healthcare professional. Once the scope of any adaptation has been agreed, and with all parties, works will be delivered as quickly as possible. This gives service personnel the reassurance their families' needs can be met wherever they are assigned, regardless of the length and number of postings they have within their service career.
Mr Speaker, the Minister will remember that in June I asked about a very badly injured veteran in my constituency who has written confirmation from the former Defence Minister at the time in 2021 that he would receive extensive adaptations to his home. They have not happened, and the situation, Mr Speaker, is so serious that Opgorridge has instigated safeguarding proceedings against the Ministry of Defence to protect my constituent. In June, the Minister requested that I write to him. I did yet again. I still have not received a reply. So, Mr Speaker, will the Minister meet with me to finally sort this out? And will he, in doing so, will he reassure the House that a Conservative Minister's word is worth the paper it's signed on?
I think that's a little harsh, Mr Speaker. I have discussed this matter with the Honourable Lady, and of course I'd be more than happy to meet with her to discuss a constituent's case further. She will forgive me if I don't share the details with the House.
We now come to topicals. We start with Simon Joe.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, I was privileged to attend the Invictus Games this weekend in Dusseldorf. It was truly humbling to meet inspiring individuals who have triumphed in adversity. I took the opportunity to discuss with my Ukrainian counterpart the care and rehabilitation of veterans and the UK's unwavering support for her country.
Simon Joe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There are more than 265,000 former members of the armed forces in the South West, many of whom reside in my constituency of East Devon. We must ensure every veteran can access the services they need when they leave the service. Can my right honourable friend update the House on the progress being made towards delivering ID cards to all veterans by Remembrance Day this year?
Well, thank my honourable friend. He will be aware that phase 1 of this project is already completed. That is to say, as people leave the armed forces, they are issued with their veterans' cards. Those who left before December 2018 should get their cards by the end of this year. A veteran doesn't require a card to prove their status. There are several ways to verify service, and the lack of a card should not act as a barrier to access support, but I do recognise the importance of this card for many, in particular, as a form of proving their identity and accessing services.
So, Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As ministers know, UK unity on Ukraine stays strong, and the government will continue to have Labour's fullest support on military aid. The Ukrainians are now urgently asking for more to help with their current counter-offensive succeed, and since January, the Prime Minister has repeatedly pledged to accelerate Ukraine support. When will this happen?
Well, the Right Honourable General will know full well that the United Kingdom, among our European peers, is probably the lead nation on many fronts, both financial, in terms of kit, and in terms of supporting the people that are conducting the fight against Putin's aggression. We will continue to do that, and at the weekend in Dusseldorf, I reiterated that to my Ukrainian counterpart. I don't think anybody can be in any doubt that it is the United Kingdom leading Europe on this front, and we will continue to do so.
John Healey.
But I fear UK leadership on Ukraine is flagging. The UK government has committed 4.6 billion, yet Germany has now committed 17 billion euros. The UK's 14 tanks have now been dwarfed by 324 from Poland, and last week's decision to prescribe Wagner as a terrorist group was taken by the European Union 10 months ago. Will the Minister accept? We must accelerate UK military support, and we must redouble the UK's defence diplomacy to maintain Western unity and solidarity.
Well, the UK government prefers action rather than words, and I would point to the 20,000 Ukrainians we're training, to Storm Shadow, to the fact that kit is going out the door right now and is being used on the ground. Rhetoric is one thing, action is another, and in that way, I'm afraid the Right Honourable Gentleman has to admit that the UK is continuing to lead Europe, and we will certainly do so going forward, and there can be no doubt that Ukrainians themselves appreciate the strength and rigour of UK's...
Order. I think the Minister also... It is topicals. I decide how quick they'll be. I don't need any help from the front bench. Can we please make sure we get these bank benchers in? If not, tell me which one you don't to allow in. Andrew Lower.
Continuity of education allowance is an important recruitment and retention facility for the armed forces, but it's not kept up with inflation in recent years. Can the Minister commit to ensuring CEA levels are not eroded into the future?
Grateful to my honourable friend. CEA is an important way of making sure that the education of service children is not disrupted. To that end, I have asked for a review of CEA to make sure that it's fit for purpose, and I'll have the results of that review later this year.
So come on.
Mr. Speaker, it's 41 years since the attack on the Sir Galahad in the Falklands conflict, in which 56 died and many more were injured. And ever since, survivors have sought transparency about what happened, but need documents declassified in full. So will ministers commit, like the previous Secretary of State, to read the papers with a view to declassifying? And will ministers meet with my constituent Mike Hermanis and other survivors to discuss this?
Very grateful to the honourable lady for her question. Yes, I can give her the commitment to meet her and her constituents if she wishes to do so.
On the Ukrainian theatre is the effectiveness and lethality of emerging drone technology. What steps are being taken to ensure that NATO has world-class, compatible, deployable drones to meet emerging threats?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend asked an excellent question. It must be clear to everyone from what is available just on social media the extraordinary impact of uncrewed air systems, as they are called, in theatre. What I want to reassure him is we are working on a UX strategy to look at how we can make the most of this capability to ensure that, above all, we have our own cutting-edge sovereign capability.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ajax fighting vehicles is proving to be something of a stealth weapon. When is it that the government will produce or provide us with a statement to this House explaining where we are up to with this project and when it will be delivered to the front line?
I don't know if the Honourable Gentleman was present. I did give a statement to the House in which I confirmed that we would learn the lessons of the Sheldon Review, but above all, the good news that Ajax was with the Field Army for regular training, and actually that training, I hear, is going extremely well.
Andrew Selou.
Dealing with the challenges which armed forces families face is vital for strong defence. I made a promise to many of those families that I was privileged to meet during the Living in Our Shoes review that the recommendations would not gather dust. How can I find out where we are on recommendations 36, 48, 68 and 96, for example?
Well, my honourable friend will forgive me if I don't, off the top of my head, know what those recommendations relate to. What I can do is to say to him that Defence is very fortunate in having my honourable friend's colleagues as co-authors of the report on the Armed Forces Family Strategy Steering Group, acting as critical friends and holding Defence to account against the Strategy Action Plan. I'd be more than happy to meet with him to go through those recommendations one by one.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell us what assessment has been made on the extent of the use of RAC within Defence estate buildings, and if there's been any assessment made at Faslane Naval Base?
Well, I would say, the Honourable Gentleman, at the moment we aren't releasing specific details because the work is ongoing. What I would assure him and the House is on 2 points. First of all, that this DIO undertaking a huge amount of work. In fact, there's been work on RAC in the MOD context since 2019. But most importantly, we are not aware of any impact of RAC on service family accommodation.
Selene Saxby.
Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that it is vital we back British military manufacturers? What steps is he taking to speed up delayed procurement decisions? And will my right honourable friend visit North Devon to meet with some of these innovative suppliers manufacturing here in the UK?
Well, it's good news on both fronts from our friend, Mr. Speaker, because first of all, yes, a lot of work going on to improve the speed of procurement, but also I'm pleased to confirm I already have planned a visit to her part of the world in a couple of weeks, and I'll liaise with her office about meeting those companies.
We take the chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks the anniversary of 9/11, and whilst our focus now has returned to state aggression, would the Minister agree that the threat of Islamic extremism, whether homegrown or indeed from abroad, remains, and our defence posture should reflect this?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Although the focus of the MOD and so many other parts of government has increasingly been on hostile state actors over the last few years. Today, more than any, is a reminder of the threat of violent extremism, and I'd like to pay tribute to the hundreds of men and women around the UK Armed Forces who are deployed on missions countering violent extremism as I speak.
Andrew Bridgen.
Could the Minister update the House on progress that's being made to settle the claims of thousands of veterans and their families with what was regarded as commonly called Gulf War syndrome?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this. The Armed Forces Compensation Scheme is up and running for them, and I'm afraid there have been delays in some of those applications, and I've referred to that earlier on. In terms of the science behind it, obviously we comply with best available as assessed by IMEG in defence, and will make policy accordingly. But I do understand the point he's making. I'd be happy to discuss it with him further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ukrainian and UK defence companies are going up against barriers and bureaucracy when they're trying to set up joint working and joint projects. So can my honourable friend update the House on how he's reducing that, so this process of bilateral collaboration can be made easier and quicker?
Well, my honourable friend has been an absolute champion of all matters relating to our relationship with Ukraine. We have actually seen very rapid procurement, particularly in relation to urgent requirements going into Abbey Wood, which I believe is in his constituency. I understand he'll be holding a meeting shortly with some major Ukrainian defence industrialists, and I believe he's kindly invited me to that, and I look forward to engaging with him and those companies soon.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it was last September that the Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk announced that there would be £2.3 billion made available in this financial year for Ukraine. Now we are here in another September with a new Secretary of State. When can we expect for the sum of money to be made available to Ukraine to be announced?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister engages with world leaders all the time to discuss what is needed in Ukraine and has an extraordinarily close relationship with President Zelensky. Both Prime Minister Truss and Prime Minister Johnson have both delivered on their commitments. Prime Minister Sunak continues to do exactly the same and is at the dispatch box in about an hour's time when perhaps Ukraine might be mentioned, Mr. Speaker.
Paul Havel.
Speaker, I'm sure the Minister would agree with me that some of our veterans make the best role models in society. But could I ask him to applaud my Setchville constituent Bill Cooksey, who at the age of 102 completed the Great North Run this weekend on behalf of NHS charities.
Mr. Speaker, what can I say? I certainly congratulate Bill, who at such an extraordinary age completed the Great North Run. I admire him hugely. My congratulations to him.
Where is Shem?
A message and a question to the Secretary of State. The previous Secretary of State promised me he would come to David Brown Gears in Huddersfield to see the wonderful work that that company does in producing the defence equipment that we need. Will one of the team be able to fulfil that promise?
He's been.
Well, it's always a pleasure to engage with the honourable gentleman. If I can't visit the specific company, I intend to hold forums for SMEs around the country. The next one is in Wales, but we'll certainly be holding one in his part of the world, and I'll let him know the details about it.
Sarah Atherton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst Ukraine continues to combat Putin's aggression on the battlefield, there's no let-up in Russia's nefarious campaign of espionage and subversion against Western democracies. This threat in the so-called grey zone spans across public, private and the defence sector, aiming to continually challenge our critical national infrastructure capabilities. So what work is the MOD doing across government departments, the private and public sector, to combat hybrid threats?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and it's helpful that the Deputy Prime Minister is sat on the bench as I answer this question, because he leads this necessarily cross-government effort. But defence plays an enormous part. The National Security Act of 2023 has been passed, the National Security Investment Act of 2021, and £2.6 billion investment through the National Cyber Strategy of 2022. Defence supports His Majesty's Government's activities, applying defence levers to protect UK critical interests from state threats by denying and deterring adversary attack.
I'm going to get a sore throat if we keep carrying on like this. Jimson.
Mr. Speaker, and one of the greatest problems that my constituents have who are veterans is housing accommodation. They're as scarce as hen's teeth, as we would say back home.
So can I ask the Minister what discussions he's had with the housing association, housing executive, housing associations in Northern Ireland to secure funding and housing for veterans who have just finished service or indeed are just retiring? Thank you.
To the honourable gentleman for his question. Clearly, we want to improve service accommodation all the time. 97% of service accommodation meets or exceeds the decent home standards. Actually, that's admirable compared with the record of many local authorities. Clearly, we're investing in accommodation. It's improving all the time, and I very much regret the occasional report of accommodation that falls short of the mark, and we'll seek to rectify it as soon as we can.
Question, Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard this afternoon how important a continuity of education allowance is for service families. Does the Minister assess that Labour's proposed attack on private schools will make it easier or harder to educate service children?
Well, it would certainly make it far more expensive. It would also threaten small schools like Warminster School in my constituency that relies very much on service families. And I just reflect on the sacrifices that are made by all people that I know who choose to send their children to independent schools, and in particular members of the defence community, who of course are required to make a substantial contribution to their children's education in the event that they choose to educate them in the independent sector.
Completes defence questions. I'll let the room clear. Right, we now come to the Cabinet's oral statement. I call the Right Honourable Oliver Dowden.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on claims relating to an ongoing counter-terrorism police investigation that were reported in the Sunday Times yesterday, Sunday the 10th of September. The story alleged that 2 individuals, including a parliamentary researcher, have been arrested on charges of conducting espionage on behalf of China. Mr. Speaker, these are serious allegations, and it is right that they are being thoroughly investigated by the police and relevant agencies. We must not hamper their work or prejudice any future legal processes by what we say today, as I believe, Mr. Speaker, you said at the beginning of today's proceedings. As you would expect me to say, Mr. Speaker, it would therefore be inappropriate for me to comment on any specific aspect of this active investigation itself. I would, however, point the House to what the Metropolitan Police has said in its own statement, namely that the investigation is being carried out by officers from the Met's Counter-Terrorism Command, which has responsibility for investigations relating to allegations of Official Secrets Act and espionage-related offences. Of course, any decision as to whether to proceed with a prosecution under the Official Secrets Act and related legislation would be a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service. Mr. Speaker, it remains an absolute priority for the Government to take all necessary steps to protect the United Kingdom from any foreign state activity which seeks to undermine our national security, prosperity and democratic values. The Government has been clear that China represents a systemic challenge to the United Kingdom and to our values. This has been evidenced in China's continued disregard for universal human rights and international commitments in Xinjiang, their erasure of dissenting voices and stifling of opposition under their new national security law in Hong Kong, and disturbing reports of Chinese coercion and intimidation in the South China Sea. Mr. Speaker, we are clear-eyed about that challenge, and we must be able to look the Chinese in the eye and call out unacceptable behaviour directly, just as our Prime Minister was able to do with Premier Li at the G20 in New Delhi this weekend, an approach that has also been taken consistently by our Five Eyes allies. But, Mr. Speaker, Actions speak louder than words, and that's why I took the decision to instruct departments to cease deployment of all surveillance equipment subject to China's national intelligence law from sensitive government sites in November last year. It's one of the reasons why I banned TikTok from government devices. It's why the government has investigated and called out so-called Chinese overseas police service stations, and, as my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, set out in a statement to this House in June, have instructed the Chinese embassy to close them. It's why we have significantly reduced Chinese involvement in the UK's civil nuclear sector, including taking ownership of China's stake in the Sizewell C nuclear power project. And it's why, as Digital Secretary, I took the decision to ban Huawei from our 5G networks. And, Mr. Speaker, this afternoon, in the other place, the procurement bill is being debated, and that will include national security debarment provisions that will enable us to act where we see malign influence in our public procurement. In taking this approach, we are aligned with our Five Eyes allies and other G7 partners, indeed every single G7 partner. So, the United Kingdom will deploy again an aircraft carrier to the Indo-Pacific in 2025. We have announced AUKUS, a new security partnership that will promote free and open Indo-Pacific that is secure and stable. And we will work with Italy and Japan through the Global Combat Air Programme to adapt and respond to security threats of the future through an unprecedented international aerospace coalition. Mr. Speaker, these Houses of Parliament stand as a monument to the freedoms of expression and belief that underpin our values. But just as these institutions have provided the paradigm for so many modern democracies, there are still those who fear such freedoms and who seek to undermine them and to interfere in our society. We maintain constant vigilance in our efforts to understand and root out this interference, and we will always take action to address it, whatever its source. In 2022, the government established the Defending Democracy Task Force. This group works to coordinate across government to protect the integrity of our democracy from threats of foreign interference. The task force is engaging across government with Parliament, the UK's intelligence community, the devolved administrations, local authorities, the private sector and civil society on the full range of threats facing our democratic institutions. These threats do include foreign interference in the electoral process, disinformation, physical and cyber threats to democratic institutions and to those who represent them, foreign interference in public offices, political parties and our universities, and transnational repression in the United Kingdom. And earlier this year, the government also passed the National Security Act. This has overhauled legislation applicable to espionage, sabotage, and any persons acting for foreign powers against the safety and interests of the United Kingdom. The measures in the Act will enable our law enforcement and intelligence agencies to deter, detect, and disrupt the full range of modern-day threats, including from China. New offences in the Act will enable the disruption of illegitimate influence conducted for or on behalf of foreign states, whether designed to advance their interests or to harm the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom government will do whatever it takes to protect our national security and this nation's democratic institutions, which have stood for centuries as a beacon of liberty, from wherever that threat may come. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Right, I now call the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his statement and advance sight of it. Maintaining national security in the face of threats to our values and to our democracy is the first duty of any government, And it is one where Labour stands ready always to work on a cross-party basis to keep our country safe. And I want to pay tribute to all those in our intelligence and security services, police and across government and beyond who work to protect our national security on the anniversary of the awful attacks of 9/11. As we remember those lost, we are in no doubt of the seriousness of the work that they do. And we recognise too the seriousness of the allegations involving espionage on behalf of China at the heart of our democracy. It is essential that the police, intelligence agencies and justice system are able to do their jobs, and we must support them in doing so. But we do need to know more about what action the government is taking against attempts by other states to interfere in our democracy and undermine our security. MI5 issued an interference alert about the Chinese Communist Party attempting to influence Parliament 20 months ago. The Security Service and others have also raised wider concerns. The Minister referred to the Prime Minister raising strong concerns about unacceptable interference with China. Can I ask, did the Prime Minister do so at the time of these arrests, or has he only done so now since they have been made public? The government also set up the Defending Democracy Task Force to look at foreign interference, but what has it actually done? Is the Minister on it? Has it produced a report for the National Security Council, as was promised? Has it looked at vetting levels and delays? The government has opposed the Lord's amendment to the National Security Bill that was put forward to introduce stronger checks on donations to political parties to ensure no foreign influence, and opposed Labour's proposal to close the loophole on shell companies. Has the task force looked at those measures, and why aren't they acting in that area? And what's being done about national security prisoners? It does beg a belief that Daniel Khalif was charged with national security offences but was able to escape under a van. So can he confirm this individual had already evaded arrest for 3 weeks when the police first tried to apprehend him, and yet he ended up in a Category B prison? And reports that in 2019 another prisoner was able to escape from Wandsworth Prison, also by hiding underneath a van. So has the review been completed of all national security prisoners, both on remand and those convicted, to see what level of prison security is in place, and if not, why not? And I'd ask him about the wider issues around risks to our national security from other states. Rightly, the Minister's taken action on sensitive surveillance equipment, and I'm glad the Ministers have accepted Labour's proposals around procurement. The Minister in his statement rightly talks of the systemic challenge that China poses, including on human rights. But the statement says nothing about the work of the Investment Security Unit. What is it doing? Nor does it say anything about the comprehensive approach we need to risks to our critical national infrastructure, where the head of MI5 has given a series of warnings, and also where the ISC, the Intelligence Security Committee, has been extremely critical in its report in July, warning of the lack of proper strategy on China and short-termism. We need to engage with China on issues around climate change and global issues, but we need also to be very robust about defending our national security. It's why the Shadow Foreign Secretary has called for a full audit of China's relationship, and why we have supported the National Security Act, but we have also raised concerns about Iran pursuing kidnap and murder threats, about Russia pursuing cyber attacks, and recognising that after 9/11 and the appalling terror attacks on 7/7, the country came together. The then Labour government worked on major counter-terror strategy involving everyone across government, police, intelligence agencies, local government and the private sector to draw up the contest strategy, which has endured and has strong cross-party support. But the government has been warned now for years about rising state challenges. So where's the contest strategy for state threats? We would support the government in producing one. A Labour government would work cross-party to produce one. But where is it? We need that contest strategy on state risks, state challenges and state threats to protect our national security. National security is too important to ignore warnings. We need urgent action to defend our national security.
Secretary Dowden.
Well, may I begin by thanking the Shadow Home Secretary for the overall constructive approach with which she has approached this issue. It is important that we treat issues like this on a cross-party basis in defence of our democratic institutions, and of course it's very timely that this statement should be made on the anniversary of 9/11. I will endeavour to address the points that the Right Honourable Lady has raised. I'm happy to write to her on any points that I miss out inadvertently. First of all, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary regularly raise with their Chinese opposite numbers Chinese interference in democratic institutions. This is an ongoing approach that has been going on for some time. Secondly, in relation to the Democracy Task Force, which is led by my right honourable friend, the Security Minister, that reports into the National Security Committee, on which I sit, and we receive regular updates of the work that he is doing, working with departments across government, not least DLUC, which is responsible for large elements of electoral integrity, but also devolved administrations, local authorities and others. The purpose of the task force is to bring together all those different elements to pursue a whole of government and society approach when addressing those threats. In relation to the points raised by the Right Honourable Lady in respect of the Investment Security Unit. So the principal purpose of the Investment Security Unit is to provide advice to me as the quasi-judicial decision maker in respect of acquisitions that may invoke national security questions. I take advice from them as to whether the government should intervene or not. It has been the case that in the past year we have issued 15 directions in respect of acquisitions. That is to say, we're asking companies to take action, the hardest end blocking it, or some other remedial action. Over half of those are in respect of Chinese companies. She's entirely right to raise the question of critical national infrastructure. There's something that I work very closely with the head of MI5 and others in respect of. It is the case that countries around the world are looking again at their critical national infrastructure, particularly in the relation to the threat of cybercrime. And remember, a lot of this cybercrime often has a blurred link with hostile states. It's something that I take very seriously. I chair regular meetings on it, and we are constantly upping the work that we do. I have to say, though, that is against a backdrop where the external threat continues to rise as well. The Right Honourable Lady raised the point about the ISC report. The government will be responding very shortly to that report. The draft is with ministers. It's about to be signed off, and I hope it will be with the House this week. And she rightly raises points about Iran, about Russia, particularly in relation to cyber, but across a whole range of issues. What I would say is, in terms of our overall approach, there's two things we've done. First of all, we have tried to give the agencies a public face to interface with businesses and private citizens through a whole-of-society approach. So, for example, GCHQ now works through the National Cyber Security Centre to advise businesses and individuals on cyber risks. Equally, we've just created the National Protective Security Agency, which essentially enables MI5 to interface with businesses and individuals on protective security. And those agencies working through the Cabinet Office, and particularly with the Home Office and Foreign Office, work across the range of issues that arise, particularly in relation to Iran and Russia. So whilst we take this investigation very seriously, and it clearly should be conducted independently, I do want to reassure the Right Honourable Lady and the House that the government is taking a whole-of-society approach across all these issues to strengthen our defences against rising threats.
Chair of the ISC, Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without referring to any specific case, may I gently remind the government that its initial response to the ISC's substantial and wide-ranging report on the national security threat from China, published just 2 months ago, was to suggest that our findings might be out of date. Will the Deputy Prime Minister therefore confirm that the full government response, when it comes, and we gather it's coming very soon, will set out specific steps to address the threat of Chinese interference, particularly within our democratic system?
Secretary.
The short answer to the honourable gentleman is yes. I have reviewed the response, and I'm content that it does exactly that, and will be with him shortly.
SNP spokesperson Kirsty Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is timely today to have a security update, and my thoughts and the thoughts of my colleagues are with all those impacted by 9/11 on this, the anniversary. I'm glad the Minister mentioned the issues in relation to sensitive government sites and cameras. It is the case, though, that members across the House had to ask questions for months around Hikvision before any action was taken by the government. Will the government commit to acting more quickly in future, and will the procurement bill, as he states, allow this to happen? I'm glad to hear about the ISC report response that will be coming. Will the government also be committing to implementing the recommendations of the ISC report on Russian interference in British politics? Hopefully that response can also come soon. In terms of specific questions on this, when did the Deputy Prime Minister himself learn of these allegations and of these arrests? Why did MPs only learn of this from the Times? And will the government institute, as soon as possible, a review into the decision-making process that led to MPs not being told about this, in order that critical updates like this are given to MPs in future and this decision-making process is never allowed to happen again?
Order, I've got to be very careful, but this is a major security issue, and it would be wrong to expect to break all that in order to brief MPs. The MPs that were needed to be told were told and worked very closely on this. So please be very careful. I think my earlier statement addressed some of the points, and if need be, we can readdress that if we pick out which you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the first overall point that the Right Honourable lady raised, we take an evidence-based approach to action. I think it's right that before ministers take action, we don't do so on a hunch or an intuition. We do so on the basis of detailed analysis provided to us by the agencies and by others, and that's precisely the approach that we took in relation to Hikvision and indeed other companies Chinese-based companies that are subject to China's national security laws. In respect of when I learnt or when others learnt, as Mr. Speaker said on a number of points in respect of it, you wouldn't expect me to give the House a running commentary on intelligence briefings that I received, but you and say the House would expect me to be briefed on all relevant matters. I would make a broader point, though, just in conclusion, in relation to parliamentary security. It is the case that we do have the Parliamentary Security Directorate, and the Parliamentary Security Directorate works very closely, particularly with the agencies, to support members of Parliament, either in terms of general advice, or if members of Parliament have specific concerns, they can raise that with the Parliamentary Security Directorate. I think that's the correct approach that respects the division between Parliament and Government and the independence of the House.
Elizabeth Truss.
Mr. Speaker, these are extremely worrying reports about the level of infiltration of Chinese-supported forces into our democracy. Does my right honourable friend agree that what we need to do is to recognise that China is the largest threat, both to the world and to the United Kingdom, for freedom and democracy? And does he not agree that the government should designate it as such?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, may I begin by paying tribute to my right honourable friend for all the work that she did in this space, particularly when she was Foreign Secretary. She is absolutely right that China represents a systemic challenge to our interests and values, and it is also the case, for example, in respect of our economic security. It is the #1 state-based threat to our economic security. And what I would say to my right honourable friend is that the government is absolutely clear-eyed about the threats that this nation faces and robust in taking action. Indeed, that's why I personally took the decisions in respect of banning Huawei from our 5G networks, in respect of Chinese CCTV technology, and indeed in relation to TikTok. And we will continue to take whatever steps are necessary, based on appropriate advice, to provide that protection for our nation and our democratic institutions.
Cavan Jones.
Thank you, Speaker. A key part of democracy is the ability to scrutinise the executive. The chair of the Select Committee at ISC has already said that Number 10's response to our China report was to poo-poo it and say that it was out of date. I understand the response was due today and it's now been put off. He mentions the Defending Democracy Task Force. We've asked for an update on that and met with radio silence. The Prime Minister has on his desk our report on international partnership. He's had it on his desk for 10 months nearly now. He usually has 10 days in which to respond. When will we get that signed off? And can I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, if he's talking about security and democracy and which he, in the terms he has, that's also got to include proper scrutiny, which this government has got a long list of examples of how it's trying to avoid it.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, proper scrutiny is provided by the Intelligence and Security Committee. I certainly take the reports produced by the Intelligence and Security Committee very seriously. I'm fully aware of the membership of the committee, just to reassure honourable members opposite. And it is precisely because we take the recommendations so seriously that the committee will receive a comprehensive response addressing all these points, including an update on the Defending Democracy Task Force.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask my right honourable friend, it's of course appalling news that we have a potential cell operating in and around Westminster, an espionage cell, and I, as a sanctioned individual alongside many of my colleagues, are particularly perturbed about this particular news. But that notwithstanding, I don't suppose it should come as perhaps any surprise, as my honourable friend's committee, the Security Committee, warned that the government was ill-prepared for this and the security measures that were necessary were not available. I therefore ask my right honourable friend a very specific question. This is, when did the Foreign Secretary get told about this investigation? Was it before he went to Beijing? And if he went to Beijing with this knowledge, did he raise it with his counterpart in Beijing? Because it's very important to know whether we have actually already said it. It's no good, by the way, coming to the dispatch box with respect and telling us that we don't talk about this. The Prime Minister did, and the investigation is not complete yesterday. So I want to know what the Foreign Secretary did. And can I just say to my right honourable friend, very importantly, that the problem lies in the mess we've got into over what we define China as with respect to us. Are they a threat? Or are they not? If they are a threat, why do we not call them a threat and take the relative action that is necessary to deal with them on that basis and sanction some people?
Prime Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend, who is a former Cabinet Minister and current Privy Councillor, knows full well that the government does not provide running commentary on updates and intelligence received by ministers. What I can assure my right honourable friend is that, first of all, it is the case that the Foreign Secretary regularly raises electoral interference and interference with our democratic institutions with his Chinese opposite number. It would not be the case, and it has not been the case generally, that specific cases, particularly those that are subject to an ongoing police investigation, would be raised. The point is the wider principle, and we have been robust and clear-eyed in addressing these points and raising them with Chinese opposite numbers. And in terms of the action that we have taken, I mean, I've set out the steps that I took in respect of TikTok and indeed Huawei, where I pay tribute to my right honourable friend's support in that piece of legislation. I think we got it to a very good place, the Telecom Security Act. It's not just the Telecom Security Act, it's the National Security Act, it's National Security Investment Act, it's the deployment of the carrier fleet. All of those things have happened within the past a short number of years. They are evidence of the seriousness with which the government takes this threat.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Prime Minister just said that he holds the Intelligence and Security Committee in very high regard. And I just wondered on that basis whether he's able to commit today to the recommendation that they made in their recent report on China, which was around updating the Advisory Council on Business Applications, their guidelines in relation to intelligence and security, particularly referencing China, and how we will ensure that they are enforced.
Well, as I said in answer to a previous question, the full response to the ISC will be coming shortly. I do think that an important point has been raised in respect of ACOBA, for which I have overall ministerial responsibility in the Cabinet Office, and it's something that I will take away and something that I will discuss with the chair of that committee, Sir Eric Pickles, formerly of this House.
Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his statement and support the action the government is taking? Just on this issue of transparency and accountability, can I ask my right honourable friend whether the data regarding the volume of both prosecutions and convictions under existing legislation, but also the new National Security Act 2023, will that be collated and made available to the House so we can track the scale of hostile state action? And can I also ask if the government has decided on any necessary changes to the MOU with the ISC, as it's required to at least consider under Section 93 of the 23 Act?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, may I begin? I don't think I've had a chance from the dispatch box to pay a genuine, heartfelt tribute to my immediate predecessor as Deputy Prime Minister. Having done the job for a few months, I have a particular appreciation of all the work that he did when he was in that post. In respect of the volume of prosecutions and convictions, we seek to be as transparent as we can be with the House. I'm sure it's something that we can take away and look at with a desire to do so. I can't give him that firm commitment from the dispatch box, but if it is possible to do so, I would very much seek to do so. And of course, we keep the MOU with the ISC under review. We don't have any current plans to change it, but we keep it under review.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yet again, we are back here as we watch watch the horse disappearing over the horizon, shutting the stable door behind it. Every time we act to take on China, everything the Deputy Prime Minister boasts about is always taken reactively. So just for once, could we get ahead of the curve here and take action in relation to genomics? And as I and others have been urging the government to do for months now, designate it as part of our critical national infrastructure so that we're not back here again in a few months' time having to explain another failure.
Well, I would just gently say to the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite, he did serve in government and in cabinet for 5 years, from 2010 to 2015. So I think members of that party do need to bear some responsibility themselves for the decisions. I think that they would have some pride in the decisions that we took. But more recently, under this majority Conservative government, we have taken a huge range of steps, including passing the National Security Act, the National Security and Investment Act. He does raise a very legitimate point in relation to genomics and its relevance to critical national infrastructure. It's not currently designated as such, but in my role in the Cabinet Office, I keep the register of critical national infrastructure under review, and it's something that I am exploring.
Tim Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank you personally for the care and support which you've shown to those of us who have been sanctioned by China? We are in the front line of this threat, but I have to say, neither before or after these revelations have any of us been offered a briefing by the parliamentary security authorities or by the Foreign Office or Home Office. In fact, I found out more about this character involved from my son, who just happened to be at university with him, than anything I've been told formally. I don't want to mention the current incident, but I do want to note that it's now a year on from when MI5 took the unprecedented almost step of issuing a security service interference alert about a character working within Parliament, for which there were no consequences. It's about a year or so on from the revelations about the activities of the Chinese Consulate General in Manchester, who thought it was his job to attack demonstrators, for which there were no expulsions, no consequences. It's months on from the recent revelations about the activities of the Confucius Institutes, which the government pledged to abolish. There have been no consequences, no abolition. Again, nothing has happened. And just a couple of weeks on from when we were promised by the Foreign Secretary he would take up the case of the sanctioned MPs and of Jimmy Lai with the Chinese Foreign Minister, and yet came away with nothing. There have been no consequences. Is not the problem, Mr. Speaker, that for all the tough talk, there are no consequences, and the Chinese know that there will be no consequences. So specifically, can I ask him, will China be in the enhanced tier of the foreign agents registration scheme?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, may I deal with the specific question first and then perhaps reflect on the wider points? We are currently reviewing which countries are within that enhanced tier, but I think there is a strong case for me. Maybe you would not expect me to make that announcement from the dispatch box until we've gone through the proper process in respect of it. What I would say in relation to my honourable friend's wider points about the Parliamentary Security Directorate, we stand ready as the government to provide any further support that MPs feel that they require, and if it is the case that the honourable gentleman feels that he requires further briefing, I'm very happy to help facilitate that with the House as well.
Very good.
Can I extend my genuine sympathy to the two Conservative colleagues who appear to have been targeted by a suspected Chinese spy who was employed in Parliament and paid for out of public funds. I do know what they're feeling. The House will be aware.
I'm not sure that's the case, and I think that's quite a bit of speculation. What I would say is I'd stick to a general question and trying to go into details of what may have happened.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did say suspected. The House will be aware that the subject of the security alert last year, Christine Lee, was never arrested, has never been charged with spying or indeed any other offence, and indeed was said by the previous Home Secretary to have done nothing criminal. However, there is a court case pending. I understand that Ms. Lee has taken out a civil suit against the government. Can the Deputy Prime Minister update the House when that case is likely to be heard and what the government hopes to learn from it?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not quite sure what to say in response to that that question. So what I would just observe is that we have, in light of the Li case and others, that's precisely why we've taken enhanced powers through the new National Security Act. And whilst I have to hold back from commenting on individual cases, I'm confident that we have a much more robust powers under that legislation that will enable us to act.
Teresa Phillips.
The ISE in its China report highlighted the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to influence, co-opt or coerce into silence potential critics of its regime in the UK. We did acknowledge that the government is waking up to this threat, is taking it more seriously, but I would highlight to the Minister that we need more urgency, and I particularly highlight, for years the ISE has been saying we need a foreign agents registration scheme. It's now on its way, but does he agree it would have been helpful if it had been in operation on the statute book at the time of the relevant events that we're considering today?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend raises some very important points. What I would just observe, and I think it goes to a lot of these questions, is that we do have a very different relationship with China to the one that we had just a few years ago. It is important that we are not naive about China, that we are clear-eyed about protecting our national security, that we are clear-eyed about the threats that it represents, and that we are robust in taking action. The Right Honourable Lady rightly highlights the foreign agents registration scheme. The secondary legislation under that will be coming before the House very shortly, which will enable us to take the relevant actions under that legislation.
Chris Bryant. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Actually, the people who've been really clear-sighted about China have mostly been on the backbenches in this House, on either side, including the honourable member over there, some who've been sanctioned, and I've been delighted to work with two successive chairs of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to whom I pay enormous tribute for the outspoken way in which they have pushed us towards the government towards a more sensible policy on China. My anxiety is we still flip-flop all over the place. This year already, we've seen foreign secretaries several foreign secretaries apart from anything else, but foreign secretaries one moment wanting to suck up to China, the next minute wanting to have robust words with China. It simply doesn't work. Why, oh why, have we still not declared that China is a threat to UK national security? Why, oh why, have we still not even seen the redacted version of the China strategy, which apparently was developed by, according to the government, was developed by the FCDO, but hasn't even been shared with other government ministries?
Well, as the Honourable knows, I have great respect for him, but I simply do not accept this slightly over-the-top characterisation of the government's approach. We have been consistent. First of all, we must protect our national interests in relation to China. That is why we've passed the legislation that I outlined. That is why I banned Huawei from our 5G networks, banned Chinese technology from surveillance equipment and others. It is also important that we secondarily align with our allies around the world. I spend a lot of time, and I know the Foreign Secretary, the Security Minister and others work very closely with nations around the world, particularly the Five Eyes, but not confined to the Five Eyes, in making sure that we share our understanding of Chinese intent and understand and we take coordinated action to protect us, not least through the military. But it is also the case that we must engage with the Chinese, as we do with many, many other countries around the world with whom we do not share a number of their values. It is not a realistic position to take to say that we should entirely cut off from engagement with China. We should engage with China, but be absolutely clear about where we disagree with them and clear-eyed in protecting our national security, which is precisely the approach that we are taking.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I think, like the honourable member from Chingford and Woodford Green, I think we can't wait to be able to discuss the merits of this case, obviously, when we can, and I understand the situation now. I just want to raise a couple of issues with the Deputy Prime Minister. I don't understand why the government, which is moving and has done lots of new things and we're getting more coherence, keeps thinking that we either bury our head in the sand or we effectively sort of go soft on elements of the relationship with China. We can debate with China, we can engage with China all we like, but we can also do so in an increasingly robust way which answers the threat that they are presenting towards us. And specifically, the one thing that the government keeps avoiding is the argument about economic dependency and the growing economic dependency that all Western nations have on China, and which will mean that in case of war in the Pacific in 2 or 5 years' time, which is what President Xi is planning for, this is what he said, we're retaking Taiwan by 2027, we will not be in a position to do anything about it without collapsing the global economy. So effectively, in the next few years, our hands are being tied by economic dependency, and every time I raise this case, the government is not even willing to produce an annual statement on economic dependency. Can we please take this issue more seriously? Because this is at the heart of security. No freedom of action means we have no security.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. First of all, I have a great deal of respect for the honourable gentleman here, and I have discussed these issues on many occasions. I would actually say I believe we're precisely taking that robust approach. And when it comes to economic dependency, that's precisely why we passed the National Security and Investment Act, which enables me, ultimately, as a minister, to take decisions to intervene where we feel that any state acquiring technology could undermine our resilience, our ability to protect ourselves, or indeed enhance the capability of other states. I've taken the decision to intervene on a number of occasions, and ultimately we have issued orders in respect of Chinese-related companies in over half of the orders that we have issued. In respect of the resilience of supply chains, that's precisely why the Prime Minister established the National Security Resilience Committee, building on work by my right honourable friend, the former Deputy Prime Minister, in relation to the resilience of supply chains. He's totally right to raise that issue. I can assure him that the government takes it very seriously and is acting.
Very Chairman.
Deputy Speaker, does the Deputy Prime Minister remind the House of just December 2016, when the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister David Cameron, was in the Plough pub in Cadston with President Xi? We were all urged to be very positive towards China. Indeed, when I expressed worries about the takeover of a global company based in Huddersfield by China, I was told to go away and be quiet. I've also consistently asked for an audit about how much of our British government and interests, British industry and interests, are owned by the Chinese. A simple audit. We've never had a positive or any reaction to that suggestion. When will the government do that?
Prime Minister.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right to highlight the fact that we have a changed approach to China. The fact is that the facts on China have changed. Its conduct in relation to Hong Kong and the national security law that it's passed, the increasing evidence of abuses in Xinjiang province, the increased aggression that we see in relation to the South China Sea. There's no room for any naivety about China. We have to be clear-eyed, and we are being clear-eyed. That is why we've passed a host of legislation, why now, to his points about what's owned by China, we have for the first time taken the power to intervene on transactions, whether it's in relation to China or other companies, in the interests of national security, and I haven't hesitated as a minister to do so.
Li Qiang.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his statement to the House? Does he agree with me that this latest episode shows clearly that it is vital that we do all we can to protect our democracy and our democratic institutions? It is right that the government continues with the protect, align and engagement strategy, but at the same time, actions speak louder than words, and that the Chinese communist state needs to hear very loudly that we will do all we can to protect our democracy.
Prime Minister.
I completely agree with the Honourable Lady's comments, and that's precisely what the Prime Minister did at the G20 summit with Premier Li this weekend just past, and that's precisely why we have introduced a wide range of legislation to address threats, including in relation to academia in respect of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, amongst many other pieces of legislation.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Integrated Review refresh was announced on the 13th of March this year, and at the time it was welcomed that funding would be doubled for building expertise in government on China. We've since learned that the doubling was from a base the previous year of 170 civil servants learning Mandarin, of whom just 20 were to attend language immersion. Given that the UK hosts over 150,000 Chinese students in the UK who are learning about English language and British culture, is that announcement of perhaps 300 training places for British government officials now sounding a little modest?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, the Integrated Review refresh was very clear about China being the #1 state-based threat to our economic security. He cites the foreign language training. That is just one element of action that we have taken to increase our capacity in relation to China. Clearly, you wouldn't expect me to comment on what the agencies are doing in respect of China, but I can assure him that within the Cabinet Office and within structures in the Cabinet Office, we are constantly increasing the amount of resource we put in, as I know the Foreign Office is as well.
Espionage.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have some sympathy with my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, for wanting to strike the right balance. And I very much welcome the fact that he recognises we've come a very long way from the ill-fated idea of a golden age with China, which was only 8 years ago, because much of what has happened was predictable and predicted, and we continue to predict what's going to happen, as he's heard this afternoon. Why is the government so squeamish about not just talking about threats from China, but by calling China a threat? What is the difference between a challenge and a threat?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for recognising the evolution and the strengthening of our approach in respect of China. I won't add to what I said previous to that. What I would say is that we continue to enhance our capability in relation to China. I've outlined a number of measures that we take, and we continue to keep all of these things under review. I want to reassure my honourable friend, and indeed other members on both sides of the House, we are absolutely clear about the threat that China represents, but at the same time it is right that we engage with China, and that is the approach that we are taking, alongside working very closely with our allies. I think that is a sensible and balanced approach to China, which in no way whatsoever underestimates the scale of the challenge in respect of China as set out in numerous documents.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Deputy Prime Minister, an attack on this place by any hostile government intent on interfering with our democracy and its structures, including its members, is a direct affront to British democracy itself. Given that several members of this place have been sanctioned by China, can he give the House assurances that steps are in place to support and protect members of this place from hostile government, and make clear that there are consequences, as the Honourable Member for East Worthing outlined?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I'm very happy to give that assurance. Of course, we respect the independence of this House, and we provide support indirectly to the House through the Parliamentary Security Directorate. But I can assure the Honourable Lady that we provide a considerable amount of resource to the House in respect of this threat.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I sympathise with my right honourable friend that on the Chinese matter, he will be facing countervailing pressures, arguments on the economic side and other arguments on the security side. Today, in his statement, he made great play of the 6 very welcome measures the government has taken to toughen Britain's stance towards the Chinese government. Can he give the House any evidence that the Chinese government has actually altered its behaviour in any way at all in response to this tough response from the British government?
Prime Minister.
Well, what I would say to the honourable is, first of all, right honourable gentleman, forgive me, it is never the case that the United Kingdom government trades off economic security for national security. National security always comes first in the approach that we take. And actually, we have seen action in response to the measures we've taken. For example, National Security Investment Act, we have blocked Chinese acquisitions of companies in this country. So we are biting directly.
Twig.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister how many requests the government has received from the Security Services chiefs in the past 12 months for additional resources to combat the Chinese security threat, and if all those requests have been met in full?
Well, you wouldn't, the honourable wouldn't expect me to comment specifically on the agencies, but I can give them a general assurance that we have provided them with the necessary resources that they need to combat all the threats that this nation faces.
James Sunderland.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you. This unsavoury episode serves as a reminder for all of us in this place of the threats that we face, not just from state interference, but also from a variety of malign actors. Can I please ask Deputy Prime Minister whether we are doing enough to think about our physical security, surveillance and counter-surveillance, malware and IT on our phones and other Trojan viruses, and also governance of MP security?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise all of these points. It is the case not just in respect of China, but also in respect of Russia, particularly in light of the Russia-Ukraine war, and indeed in respect of Iran and other hostile states, that the threat landscape is increasing, and the government has to continually increase its actions. What I would say is that by the creation of the National Cyber Security Centre, working with GCHQ, we're able to constantly increase our action in respect of cyber threats, malware and others that he highlighted, and in respect of physical security, we have a mirror in the National Protective Security Agency working with MI5. Those in turn also work with the Parliamentary Security Directorate, which deals directly with threats to members of Parliament and is supported by the agencies and others.
Mary Rimmer.
Yeah. The Chinese Communist Party has shown once again it will stop at nothing to get its way. And the Deputy Prime Minister has said today that you do realise that there are serious issues and it's a systemic challenge. But they will not come out with the statement of it being a serious threat and being treated such. It is infiltrating our academia, and a lot feel very uneasy right across these benches. Actions speak louder than words, but you need to back up words with actions, strong actions, and give us the impression that that government is not being dragged by the heels all the time. We're constantly having to raise things, and the feeling there is no confidence around that we are taking them absolutely as a serious threat, and that is what they are. And we're playing cricket while they've got the machetes out. Please, please take some urgent action.
Prime Minister.
Well, we have been totally clear-eyed about the threats represented by China, and we have been robust in the action that we have taken. Indeed, the Honourable Lady talks about higher education. We have passed legislation in respect of higher education, in respect of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. That, in turn, requires greater transparency about sources of funding for higher education institutions, including from states overseas and hostile states. We are taking exactly the kind of action that she requests.
Woman.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I saw firsthand at what was then DCMS, the now Deputy Prime Minister, oversee an increasingly robust attitude to China in terms of economic security and in terms of telecom security in particular. And to some extent, I wonder if that is why we see this growth in unwelcome attention from China. I wonder if, however, he can reassure the House that we will continue to take that increasingly robust approach, particularly when it comes to emergent technologies such as AI and such as some of the other increasingly high-tech areas where Britain excels in the world and where we will continue to attract even more interest from unfriendly states.
Well, my honourable friend has a great deal of experience from his time as a minister, and we work together on these issues. Telecom security is precisely an example of that. First of all, we put national security before economic security on a purely economic security, a purely economic interest basis. We should not have removed Huawei's equipment from our networks. We put national security first, and I was very transparent with the House about that. We also took the powers through the Telecom Security Act, the legislation required to provide that protection of our national security. So it's yet more evidence of how the government is taking a more robust approach and is increasing the amount of activity it takes with every passing month and year.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his statement, and sensitive to the restrictions of both the questions and the answers. But the facts we know that are in the public domain is that 2 individuals have been arrested on suspicion of working for a hostile power. They were parliamentary pass holders. Their passes will have been sponsored by individuals probably in this chamber. They passed the vetting for having a security parliamentary pass. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that in due course an important question that will have to be answered, not today, is going to be, were they recruited by the hostile power before or after they became pass holders?
Be careful what detail we do go into, and I know you're well aware of that, Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, well, the honourable gentleman made a number of suppositions in his questions which are subject to an ongoing police investigation. When that investigation has concluded, and indeed if the Crown Prosecution Service decides to take any action under the Official Secret Act, there will be a time for this House to debate the lessons from that, and the Government will, of course, help to facilitate with you, Mr. Speaker, the time for that to happen.
Come back, Don.
In the statement, the Deputy Prime Minister very helpfully refers to, and I quote, the erasure of dissenting voices and the stifling of the opposition under their new national security law in Hong Kong. In whatever dialogue that now takes place with the Chinese, can I ask again that the cases of my 2 colleagues, trade union colleagues, Li Qiang and Karen Manyi, who are the leaders of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, be raised again? They've been in detention since 2021 and are now facing lengthy prison sentences purely for standing up for democratic rights and trade union rights.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, ministers both raised the general principle of China's national security law and its application to Hong Kong and suppression of liberties in Hong Kong in very robust terms with their Chinese opposite numbers, and will raise individual cases. And I'm happy to pass on to the Foreign Secretary, if he has not done so already, to make sure that individual cases are raised.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These allegations are concerning, but sadly they're not the first of the type. We've heard about the sanctions against MPs, the activity at the Manchester consulate. I've been ticked off more than once by the consulate in my own constituency because I said things they didn't like, and I've been filmed by a drone speaking at a Chinese rally in the city. In July, the Intelligence and Security Committee said there was a lack of a clear strategy from the government. Does the Deputy Prime Minister accept that that might be responsible for these repeated attempts, and is it not time that the government had that clear strategy?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
First of all, the integrated review refresh was very clear about the approach that we take in respect of China. We're clear that it represents the #1 state-based threat to our economic security. It also represents a range of other threats and a systemic challenge to our interests and our values. Ministers have raised Chinese interference with democratic processes, and any interference with the conduct of members of Parliament is totally unacceptable, and we will not hesitate in raising it.
That completes the statement. We now come to the next statement on the G20. I call the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in sending our sympathies to the people of Morocco following the devastating earthquake. Our thoughts are with those who have lost loved ones, the injured, and those bravely engaged in rescue efforts. We also remember the victims and loved ones of the terrorist attacks that took place in the United States 22 years ago today, including many British citizens. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned from the G20 summit in India. And for the record, let me declare that, as is a matter of public record, I and my family are of Indian origin. My wife and her family are Indian citizens with financial interests in India. At the summit, I had 3 aims. First, to increase diplomatic pressure on Russia and call out their shameful disruption of global food supplies in the Black Sea. Second, to show the world that democracies like the United Kingdom, not authoritarian regimes, are leading the fight on global challenges like development and climate change. And third, to strengthen ties and forge new partnerships to deliver jobs, growth and security for the British people. Mr. Speaker, the world faces a moment of danger, volatility and increasingly rapid change. But even as most G20 leaders came together in Delhi in a spirit of cooperation, one did not. For 2 years now, Putin has lacked the courage to face his G20 peers. Day after day, his actions cause horrendous suffering in Ukraine, violating the UN Charter, threatening European security, and disrupting global energy supplies. The spillovers have driven up prices here at home, and they are hurting people all around the world. Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative exposes their willingness to spread that suffering further. While Putin stalls, making unmeetable demands, he's destroying Ukraine's ports and grain silos. In just 1 month, Russia has destroyed over 270,000 tons of grain, enough to feed 1 million people for a year. And I can tell the House today that thanks to declassified intelligence, we know the Russian military targeted a civilian cargo ship in the Black Sea with multiple missiles on the 24th of August, demonstrating just how desperate Putin is. At the G20, leaders united in calling out the human suffering caused by Putin's war. Ukraine has the right to export its goods through international waters, and they have the moral right to ship grain that is helping to feed the world. The UK is working with partners to get grain to those who need it most. We'll provide £3 million for the World Food Programme, building on earlier contributions to President Zelensky's Grain from Ukraine initiative. We're using our intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities to monitor Russian activity in the Black Sea, so we can call them out if we see they're preparing further attacks on civilian shipping or infrastructure, and attribute attacks if they happen. And later this year, we're hosting a UK Global Food Security Summit to put in place solutions for the long term. Mr. Speaker, I spoke to my friend President Zelensky just before the summit. Backed by our support, Ukraine's counter-offensive is making hard-won progress. We will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, until we see a just and durable peace that respects their sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's the only possible outcome to Putin's illegal war, and Ukraine, with our support, will prevail. And on my second aim, Mr. Speaker, we showed at the G20 that it is the UK and our partners, not authoritarian actors, that offer the best solutions to the global challenges we face. We're playing our part to stabilise the global economy, control inflation, and fuel future growth. The latest ONS figures show the UK is leading the way, growing faster out of the pandemic than any other major European economy, demolishing the false narratives that we've heard on the other side of this House. And we're also leading the way on development assistance. Instead of loading countries with debt, we're calling for fundamental reforms of the World Bank. When I met the World Bank president, I underlined the UK's desire to see the bank become more efficient and responsible, sweating its balance sheet to deliver more support where it's needed. We're also leading calls at the G20 to safely harness new technologies to support growth and development, and we're leading action to tackle climate change. Mr. Speaker, while some in Westminster denigrate the UK's record on climate issues, out there in the world, we are rightly seen as a global leader. We've cut emissions faster than any other G7 country, with low-carbon sources now providing over half our electricity. We're providing billions for the global energy transition, including through our pioneering Just Energy Transition partnerships. And at the G20, I made a record commitment of over £1.6 billion for the Green Climate Fund, the single biggest international climate pledge the UK has ever made. Finally, Mr. Speaker, my most important aim in Delhi was to deliver on the priorities of the British people. In a changing world, we're using our Brexit freedoms to build new relationships with economies around the world. Since I became Prime Minister, we've joined the CPTPP, the most dynamic trading bloc in the world. We've launched new partnerships with Canada, Australia, Japan and the US, covering trade and economic security. We've secured agreements with France, Albania and Turkey and others to stop illegal migration. And at the G20, we went further. We signed a new strategic partnership with Singapore to boost jobs, growth and our security. And I held warm and productive discussions with Prime Minister Modi on strengthening our relationship in defence, technology and a free trade deal between our nations. Mr. Speaker, I also met Premier Li of China. The whole House is rightly appalled about reports of espionage in this building. The sanctity of this place must be protected, and the right of members to speak their minds without fear or sanction must be maintained. We will defend our democracy and our security. So I was emphatic with Premier Li that actions which seek to undermine British democracy are completely unacceptable and will never be tolerated. I also emphasised the UK's unyielding commitment to human rights, and I was clear on the importance of maintaining stability and international law as the basis for stable relations. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the world's second largest economy and the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, and has growing influence on others, notably Russia. One of my messages to Premier Li was that China should use their influence to call on Russia to end its aggression against Ukraine. The G20 showed a common purpose on food security, and we need to see this in other areas. Mr. Speaker, this government has acted decisively to improve our security, blocking China's involvement in critical areas like civil nuclear power, semiconductors and 5G. And I pay tribute to the tireless work of our security services. We will shortly set out our response to the Intelligence and Security Committee's report on China. In November last year, the government set up a new Defending Democracy task force. Its mission is to reduce the risk to the UK's democratic processes, institutions and society, and ensure they're secure and resilient to threats of foreign interference. The importance of that work is clear for all to see. And crucially, in taking this approach, we are aligned with each and every single one of our Five Eyes allies and our G7 partners. Because by speaking frankly and directly, we will ensure our messages are heard clearly and that our interests and values are protected and promoted. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, at a time of rapid change, we are bringing British values and British leadership to bear on the biggest global challenges. As one of the fastest growing major economies, the second largest contributor to NATO, and a global leader in everything from climate to tech to development, I'm proud of the United Kingdom's leadership. And it is through that leadership, working with our allies and partners, that we will increase our security, grow our economy, and deliver on the priorities of the British people. And I commend this statement to the House.
Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement, and can I join him in sending my condolences and those, I'm sure, of the whole House to those affected by the devastating earthquake in Morocco. I know UK search and rescue specialists are working to help Moroccan authorities find survivors, and it is important at this time that all those in Morocco know that we are thinking of them and prepared to give the resources and the support that they need. Mr. Speaker, the G20 summit in India was a real opportunity to see progress on key global issues by condemning Russia's illegal war in Ukraine in no uncertain terms and making solid commitments to boost growth and renewable energy capacity around the world. So I'm afraid the joint declaration from the weekend is disappointing. As Russian drones resumed attacks on Kyiv, it is disheartening to see language weaker than the G20's condemnation of Moscow at last year's summit in Bali. On this issue, the House speaks with one voice. There is no ambiguity. We all agree this is an unjust, illegal war against Ukraine. And I join the Prime Minister in saying that Britain and our NATO allies will remain committed in helping Ukraine defeat Putin. Mr. Speaker, on the matter raised in the preceding statement, the news of the arrest of a researcher here in Parliament on suspicion of spying for China is a serious breach of security conducted by the Beijing security services. Given the arrest happened in March, can I ask the Prime Minister if the Foreign Secretary knew about this incident before he visited China last month? And if he did he raise it on that trip? I listened to the answers given in the preceding session by the Deputy Prime Minister, who said that regularly these issues are raised. But my question is specific, and I would ask the Prime Minister to address it directly. And if, as it seems, the government is not considering designating China as a threat to national security, can he give further details on how they will tackle the infiltration of Chinese security services on key British institutions? Incidents like this show the constant threats that we face, and the G20 shows how far we have to go. There was some important progress at the G20 this weekend. A new partnership for global infrastructure and investment was announced between the US, the EU, India and Gulf states. A partnership to counterbalance China's Belt and Road Initiative, boost economic development, secure supply chains and connect the US, EU and trusted partners in Asia. A much welcome initiative, you might think. So when I looked at the signatories of this new partnership, I was surprised. Something was missing. Where was Britain? Can the Prime Minister explain why the UK has not signed this agreement? This seems remarkable. A new agreement has been reached between major trade blocs to deliver economic security, and Britain is not involved. That's right. I think the Prime Minister owes the House an explanation. Have we been left out, or just decided not to sign? Because the race towards the future has begun. Major nations are investing in new technology, hoping to establish themselves as leaders and major global centres for green technology. The US has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act. The EU, in return, is relaxing rules to allow greater green subsidy. Where is Britain? Where is the plan? I'd also like to ask the Prime Minister about the trade deal between India and the UK. They promised this in their manifesto. Then they said it would be done by Diwali last year. Now the Prime Minister says the deal is not even guaranteed. What's going on? Mr. Speaker, it really sums up their global economic approach. No strategy and no direction. We can't be slow off the mark. The race has started. They once promised a new era of post-Brexit global trade. But instead of more investment and more trade, they've erected unnecessary barriers and made Britain a more difficult country to do business in. We can't be left on the sidelines. Britain needs a seat at the table. We have the expertise, the creativity and the ingenuity. But this government is too distracted, too complacent and has no plan to seize the opportunities of the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just rattle through the honourable gentleman's questions. With regard to the matter that was covered in the preceding statement, I'm sure he'll appreciate that as there is an ongoing investigation, as you've also said, Mr. Speaker, as I'm limited in what I can say specifically, but I've been emphatically clear in our engagement with China that we will not accept any interference in our democracy and parliamentary system. This includes sanctioning of MPs and malign activity, such as the type of activity alleged to have taken place. I can absolutely confirm that the Foreign Secretary raised these issues on his recent visit, and I also reinforce this in my meeting at the G20. The honourable gentleman then went on to raise the announcement about the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. What he failed to mention in his criticism was that that initiative, the PGII, was something that the UK itself created under our G7 presidency. Far from being something that we are not part of, we were the ones who made sure we were there at its inception, Mr. Speaker. And, well, again, the honourable gentleman jumping as ever on the latest bandwagon that he can find. The PGII is an initiative that will contain a range of different projects, Mr. Speaker. This particular one was also not signed by Canada, by Japan, by Italy, for example. Each and every country will participate in a range of projects. So what did we do, Mr. Speaker, to make our contribution? As I said, we made the single largest pledge this country has ever made to the Green Climate Fund. Why? Because it's important that we play our part in helping countries make the transition to net zero, something that we have led on previously, and because of that commitment, we'll continue to lead on. What else did we do, Mr. Speaker? We decided to work with other countries to improve global food security, something that in particular African nations have called on us to do, have welcomed our leadership in hosting a summit later this year that will tackle the cause at root, improving crop yields and improving the resilience of food supplies globally. I could go on, Mr. Speaker, but as ever, the honourable gentleman tries to find something to score a cheap political point and completely and utterly misunderstands what this country is doing, because as ever, well, he would prefer to talk this country down and recognise the contribution we are making. And then, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to address his comments on the trade deal. I thought this was telling, Mr. Speaker, because I had a flashback. He was asking, why don't we just sign it? Why isn't it done? I had a flashback to all those conversations when we were leaving the EU, Mr. Speaker. Because his approach back then was just sign any deal that was offered to us. And we know where that would have led, Mr. Speaker. The right thing to do for the British people is to fight hard for the things that we need, Mr. Speaker. We only need a deal that works for the British people, that delivers on our priorities, which is why it's right not to rush these things, as he would do, clearly. We don't put arbitrary deadlines on them, Mr. Speaker. I take the time to make sure that they are right for the British people. And our track record is there, Mr. Speaker. We are the first European nation to accede to the CPTP Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Something else he failed to mention. That is the most exciting dynamic trade bloc that exists in the world. It accounts for 50% of the world's population, the Asia-Pacific. 60% of goods trade passes through that region, and it will account for over half of global growth in the coming decades. Now that we've left the EU, we are able to join that trade bloc, and they are excited, Mr. Speaker, to have us. Very lastly, I'll just touch on his point again about Brexit. Again, he failed to point out that since we have left the single market, we've actually grown faster than France and Germany, Mr. Speaker. So I'll end where I started. As ever, when it comes to these things, he is determined to talk Britain down. We are demonstrating that Britain is leading on the global stage and delivering for the British people.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia comes.
Can I start by putting on record my thanks to you, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Security Service and Intelligence Services for your personal support over the last few months. But here today, we know that across this House, a real priority for members is the safety of British nationals when they are arbitrarily detained abroad. And the Foreign Affairs Committee has recently released a report on that matter. It cannot be right that consular access is withheld on the basis of diplomatic silence being held in place. I know that my right honourable friend raised the case of Jagdish Sohal with the Indian Prime Minister at the weekend, but we are not clear on what the outcomes of those discussions were. So will the government now finally officially call for him to be released because the UN has accepted that he is arbitrarily detained? And does the Prime Minister believe that he has been unfairly treated or even tortured while he's been held?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to seeing Mr. Jahal's case resolved as soon as possible. We continue to provide consular assistance to him and his family and have raised concerns about issues including consular access to Mr. Jahal, the judicial process and reports of mistreatment with the Indian government on multiple occasions, including myself with Prime Minister Modi just this weekend.
SNP spokesperson Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot of PR and spin today, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more. But as ever in this game, what the Prime Minister isn't saying is almost as important as what he is saying. Now, the Leader of the official opposition raised the case of President Biden's announcement. Can the Prime Minister in his response then tell us what part of those projects his government is involved in, because it's worth more than any FTA agreement we could sign and will leave Brexit Britain on the global sidelines yet again if he's not fully involved. That's on top of the United States inflation-busting reduction bill tackling climate change. And on to the bilateral meetings, Mr. Speaker, with his counterparts. We heard of very strong concerns raised with the Chinese Premier Li in regards to your statement earlier on, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister therefore advise the House when was he first notified of this issue? And then there was also the case of my constituent Jagtar Singh Johal, which the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee has raised, where he brought up in conversations with Prime Minister Modi's counterpart. Now, given the widespread concerns in this place and outside of the leaking of his government's resolve to Jagtar Singh Johal, particularly in relation to getting a trade deal over the line, would therefore the Prime Minister agree to meet with me and Jagtar Singh Johal's family so he can tell them exactly what he intends to do on their behalf?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd refer the honourable gentleman to my previous answer on Mr. Jahal, but also most recently the Foreign Office Minister has met with Mr. Jahal's family to discuss this case in detail. Turning to the honourable gentleman's other points, for example, our other investment partnerships, the British investment partnership approach with India, for example, has invested over £2 billion to support 600 different enterprises employing about 500,000 people. And that's just to give him some sense of the scale of the alternative projects that we are involved in. And then lastly, I'll just turn to his point, which the Leader of the Opposition also raised about the US's IRA Act and other countries' approach to this. Again, neither of them seem to recognise that the approach we have taken is working for the UK, not least with the recent announcement of a £4 billion investment in the UK by Tata, Mr. Speaker. That represents the single largest investment in our auto industry, potentially ever, to build a gigafactory here, also followed by investments from Stellantis and BMW to secure future electric vehicle manufacturing in the UK, Mr. Speaker. So any which way you look at it, our auto manufacturing sector is receiving record amounts of investment to make the transition to electricity-oriented vehicles, and that's because of the tax, regulatory and incentive regime that we've put in place that is delivering real jobs and real opportunity for the British people.
Sir John Redwood.
Did the Chinese representatives give any indication of when they might stop their big increases in CO2 and start to reduce them? And does the Prime Minister agree with me that it makes no sense for the UK to rely on Chinese imports of electric vehicles, solar panels and other green products when they are so CO2 intensive in their production and deny us the jobs and added value?
My honourable friend makes a good point. He'll see in the G20 declaration a commitment by all members recognising the need to peak emissions in the next couple of years. And to his broader point, that's why the government has consulted on measures to address carbon leakage. It's absolutely right that there's a level playing field, Mr. Speaker, and that if we take action here, that should not come at the cost of British workers if it makes ultimately no difference to global emissions, which is why we've consulted on proposals on carbon leakage, and I'd very much welcome his thoughts on that.
Ed David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the House in sending our condolences to all those affected by the tragic events in Morocco. And can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? He was rightly strongly critical in his statement of President Putin, but I have to say I do not agree with his assessment of the G20's statement on Ukraine. The joint declaration failed to condemn Russia for the invasion. Our Ukrainian allies labelled it nothing to be proud of, while the Russians called it a step in the right direction. As Ukrainian soldiers continue to give their lives in defence of their country, while Ukrainian refugees continue to take shelter here in the UK and elsewhere, why did the Prime Minister feel he was justified in signing up to such a weak communique?
Mr. Speaker, I find it slightly strange that the right honourable gentleman is using what Russia describes the situation to be as evidence for his support. I mean, if anything we've seen over the past year, we shouldn't believe a word coming out of Russia's mouth. So a very strange approach to take, Mr. Speaker. But what I would say to him in his criticism, I'm not entirely sure who he's critical of, because every single one of our Five Eyes partners and our G7 allies that was present also signed the G20 statement. And that's because we fought hard to have a statement that we thought did, in fact, as the US themselves have said, including the President and the Treasury Secretary, contain substantially very strong language regarding Russia. I went out to that summit specifically to raise the impact of Russia's illegal war on food security and food prices. The language in the summit goes further than what we have had before, highlighting that, calling for an end to attacks on food and civilian infrastructure, and to restore the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and also agreed on the significance of securing, and I quote, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter, including territorial integrity. That's why all of our allies, and I could go through the list of them, worked hard for that statement and supported it. And his criticism may well be of me, but he's also criticising every single one of our closest allies.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I welcome the robustness of the Prime Minister's stance on Russia, but does he agree with me that there are aspects of other topics like China at the G20 which he might not be able to discuss in full on the floor of the House, but which he could discuss securely with the Intelligence and Security Committee? However, whereas for the first 20 years of the committee's existence it had a meeting with the Prime Minister every single year, there has been no such meeting since December 2014, although his immediate predecessor during her short term in office did volunteer to reinstate such meetings. So may I ask him if he would do the same thing, reinstate the meetings and get back to proper comprehensive scrutiny?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to consider my honourable gentleman's request, but in the meantime, what I will say is I very much welcome the committee's report on China and are grateful to all its efforts. The government is in the process of considering its recommendations and conclusions carefully. We'll publish our response in due course and in the usual manner.
Sir Christopher Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surely one of the things that should keep the Prime Minister awake at night is whenever a British national is Sorry.
Unfortunately, I've got a member behind who feel they should be taken first. Can I just say, he's second on the committee. He's one of the longest serving members on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Sir Christopher Brown.
As I was saying, seconds out, round two. The one thing that should keep the Prime Minister awake, or any minister awake, is when a British national is arbitrarily detained in a foreign country. And you would hope that ministers, and the Prime Minister himself, would summon up every ounce of energy to try and get people released. I'm sorry, but I think quite a lot of us are very depressed by the Prime Minister's own answer to the question from the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee earlier about Jagtar Singh Johal, who has been arbitrarily detained now for 6 years. Everybody knows that he is being tortured and he is being mistreated. I took the Prime Minister to say that he has not called for his release. Is that really the truth?
No, Mr. Speaker. As I said to the honourable gentleman, or I said in answer to the previous honourable gentleman, we've consistently raised our concerns about Mr. Jahal's case with the government of India, including allegations of mistreatment and the right to a fair trial. That's why the Foreign Office and ministers are providing direct support to Mr. Jahal's family, and why I raised this specific case with Mr. Modi.
Tobias Selwood.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome this statement and also the Prime Minister's leadership on Ukraine? Our national security and our economic security are interdependent, and that's no better illustrated than those grain ships trying to get out of Odessa. He mentioned the Global Food Security Summit. Could he expand on this? And he knows that I've been campaigning for some time for an international maritime protection force to help escort those ships out. That won't just help the Ukrainian economy, it'll also help our own, because the food inflation is affected by that as well. Will he now advance that idea to make sure that happens at the Food Security Summit?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend, because he has actually rightly focused on this issue of maritime security in the Black Sea for some time, and he was correct to do so. We are talking and working with partners, allies, and indeed Ukraine to consider all different ways that we could ensure the safe access of grain out of Ukraine, and will continue to do so. In terms of the Global Food Security Summit that we will host in London, it will be focused on 4 themes, Mr. Speaker: creating new approaches to ending the preventable deaths of children, building a climate-resilient food system, anticipating and preventing famine and food security crises, and using science and technology to boost food security and nutrition. We are also working to deliver this food summit in combination with partners including the United States and Somalia.
Member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the sympathies extended to the people of Morocco, and can I welcome the language that's in paragraph 50 of the G20 communique about building a bigger World Bank. The truth is, however, that we need to triple the lending of multilateral development banks if we're to mobilise the climate finance that the world now needs. We can't do that by simply building a better World Bank. We need to build a bigger World Bank. Now, in the United States, President Biden is asking Congress to support a capital call and boost the balance sheet of the World Bank. Why is the UK, one of the founders of the World Bank, not leading the same argument? We could even use the money we're getting back from the European Investment Bank, and the Prime Minister, if he so chose, could call it a Brexit dividend. The world needs a bigger World Bank now, and the UK should be leading the case.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are, in fact, leading the case on the World Bank's balance sheet. My right honourable friend, the Development Minister, has had extensive conversations with the President of the World Bank on precisely that matter, and it's something I discussed with colleagues at the G20, and including with the World Bank President himself. But we are also broadly leading the way on how else we can reform the international financial system, including pioneering the use of climate-resilient debt clauses, which has been welcomed by countries around the world, channeling our IMF SDRs back for use for developing countries, and finding ways, as I said, to stretch balance sheets to unlock more funding. The UK is looked to as a leader in all of these areas, and not least we're announcing conditional capital increase for the IRBD, Mr. Speaker. All of these things together position us as a thought leader in changing the international financial system. It was a subject of my interventions at the G20, and the Development Minister, as I said, is taking forward this work at pace with our allies.
Sir Battleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, and in particular welcome inclusion in the communique to the G20 AI principles. And I'd like to press my honourable friend as to what further work he and the United Kingdom will be doing ahead of the AI summit in November to ensure that work on the safety of AI more than outpaces work on capability, and that we can move towards a meaningful principles-based approach to the safe use of this vital new technology.
Can I thank my honourable friend for the question? He's absolutely right about the need for global cooperation when it comes to AI safety, a technology that obviously doesn't respect national borders. Again, this is an area where the UK is demonstrating leadership, building on our expertise and leading position in AI research. We are having the conversation with partners about what that principles-based approach to regulation would look like to ensure consistency across jurisdictions, but also seeing what we can do to make sure that the UK is the leading place for that AI safety research, and that is the work of our AI task force, which is currently underway and proceeding well.
Florence Session-Lomi.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome African Union as a permanent member of the G20. Africa is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's important that her voice is at the table discussing some of these major global issues, from climate change, security and economic stability. My own country of origin, Nigeria, is one of the largest in Africa, with over 223 million and rising on a daily basis. Can the Prime Minister outline what strategy and steps his government has towards a strategy for the continent?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her excellent question, and I join her. We were delighted to agree African Union membership of the G20. And she's right to highlight the importance of Africa, increasing importance of Africa in global affairs. Over the next decade or so, Africa's population will double to 2.5 billion people, with 60% of those under the age of 25. But also, Africa contributes just 4% of global emissions, but is home to 35 of the 50 countries most at risk from climate change. So it's important we're engaged and supportive. I can tell you what we are doing is, now that we've left the European Union, are in charge of our trade policy. We've changed our tariff structure so that 98% of goods imported into the UK from Africa will enter tariff-free. We are making sure that our just energy transition partnerships help countries like South Africa with their transition, mobilising billions of dollars of support. And next year we will be hosting the Africa Investment Summit with over 20 different countries, because the UK, as measured by FDI, is the largest investor in the continent.
Looking forward. Speaker, in an ever more dangerous world, having allies and partners is really important, and trust is so important to keep those allies. So can I thank my right honourable friend for the commitment he made on climate change. It was a commitment we gave in Glasgow at COP, and this shows that Britain is a country that keeps its promises. Would he like to show examples of how that money is going to be spent, how it will make our allies and partners stronger, and how that will help strengthen our own security too here in the UK?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for all her work in this area, and she's right, it's important that we do meet our commitment to £11.6 billion of international climate finance, and this particular investment will ensure that we do that. It was warmly welcomed by partner countries at the G20, and she will know that the importance of giving money through this multilateral fund rather than bilaterally is that it can be leveraged at multiple times. So every pound that we contribute will be able to be used multiple times more, attract more capital, and in that way we are helping to fund literally hundreds, if not thousands, of projects across the world, and I know that our countries that benefit from them are extremely grateful for us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his private meeting with Mr. Modi, did he raise the issue whilst we're supporting Ukraine? India is buying huge amounts of oil and also trading in engineering, manufacturing and technology stocks. Did he also, in terms of trade agreement with the UK, raise the issues of human rights, of the Dalit community, of the Sikh community in Jagtar Johol particularly, and did he raise the issue of the Christian community, the abuses that are taking place, and long-standing abuse of the Kashmiri community? In order for us to have a trade agreement, we must have a fair and based on human rights and international law.
Well, Mr. Speaker, supporting democracy and human rights is a core part of our engagement, not just with India, but with all countries that we engage with. And when it comes to the position or the situation in Kashmir, my view is it's not for the United Kingdom to prescribe a solution or act as a mediator in that situation.
Shalish Farah.
Speaker, Article 30 of the G20 Leaders' Declaration speaks of delivering quality education. Mahatma Gandhi said, and I paraphrase, that if you educate a man, you educate an individual. If you educate a woman, you educate a family. The UK is certainly doing as much as it can to ensure that those who need education across the globe receive it, especially girls and women. Could the Prime Minister give an assurance that the UK will do all it possibly can to ensure that the other members of the G20, including new member the African Union, do their bit to ensure that the girls and women in their countries and across the world are educated?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was a privilege to visit Rajgarh and pay tribute to Gandhiji's work. And my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance of equality and access to women's education. I was very pleased that Prime Minister Modi made this actually a central theme of the G20 summit, so it's something we discussed. And in this House, we should all be proud of the UK's contribution, where over the last several years we've helped educate over 8 million girls as part of our development priority to provide all girls with 12 years of high-quality education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anybody in this chamber takes seriously what the Russians may have to say about the G20, but we are listening to what the Ukrainians said, and in particular their statement that there was nothing to be proud of in the joint statement that was produced. Now, the Prime Minister spoke about speaking to President Zelensky before the summit, when he next rings him, how will he explain the fact that the statement didn't even mention the word Russia?
Prime Minister.
I know President Zelensky was incredibly supportive of our efforts to highlight Russia's aggression for the impact it's having on food prices and food security and the damage that it's done to civilian infrastructure. He'll be grateful for the fact that we've declassified intelligence which shows the world about those attacks on civilian ships, and I know he'll be grateful for the work we're doing with them to find alternative means to export Ukrainian grain out to the world, which is not just good for the Ukrainian economy and their sustainability, but also good for millions of the world's most vulnerable people.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the statement by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has said the ending the war in Ukraine and holding Russia to account is a top priority. As somebody who dealt with sanctions at the Foreign Office as Minister, sanctions is a key tool for the United Kingdom to address Putin's war machine. The question I ask Prime Minister is this, specifically. There are 44 non-aligned states who are not supporting us with sanctions against Russia, which is delaying the war in Ukraine. One of them is India. India takes Russian oil, and some now say it refines it and sells its products back into Europe, circumventing those sanctions. Did the Prime Minister have those conversations with Prime Minister Modi? And after those conversations, will India now change its behaviour?
Mr. Speaker, our position is long-standing and consistent with all countries, which we urge to follow our lead and the lead of others in sanctioning Russia. Obviously, each country is going to approach that in its own way. Our job is to continue raising the impact of Russia's illegal war and working with allies to bring that war to an end, including through enforcing our own sanctions, working with allies. That's why I announced the Economic Deterrence Initiative earlier this year in March with £50 million of funding to make available to improve our enforcement of the UK sanctions regime, something that we're developing closely with our partners and I think will help to tighten the vice on Russia's economy.
Mr. Speaker, in answer to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister claimed praise for the inception of the Global Partnership of Infrastructure and Investment. The agreement that was signed by the US, by India, by Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates, by France, Germany, Italy and the European Union itself is described as a landmark agreement creating an economic corridor across Europe, the Middle East and India. So if the inception of the Global Partnership is worth claiming praise for, can he explain, because he didn't answer that question earlier on, can he explain why Britain wasn't a signatory to that Memorandum of Understanding?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously, each country will contribute to the effort in its own way, and we are participating in many different projects together with our partner countries that help countries lessen their dependence on China. One thing we've done and led on is actually the development of the common framework to ensure that countries can get appropriate debt relief, something that they, again, are very grateful to our leadership on. China having put many countries in hock to them, we have created a framework, made sure that China is engaged with it, and that is already providing relief to 2 countries, and we're making sure that there are more in the pipeline. That's been very welcome, and again, it's just an example of our leadership in making a difference on these complicated matters.
Sir Desmond Swain.
In 2015, I went to Delhi to implement the coalition government's decision to end grant development aid to India. That policy hasn't changed, has it?
No, well, Mr. Speaker, the policy did change and we stopped providing traditional development aid to India in 2015. Most UK funding is now in the form of business investments, which help India reduce carbon emissions, address climate change, but also deliver jobs and opportunity for British companies here at home.
Catherine West.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, with so much at stake, the war in Ukraine, increasingly high numbers of people suffering from famine and drought, and indeed human rights in places like Iran or the Xinjiang part of China, is now really the time for the Prime Minister to empty chair the UNGA?
Good question.
Mr. Speaker, as I've just been over, our leadership on these matters is unquestioned. We are an active and engaged member at the G20. In just a couple of weeks, I'll be at the European Political Community Summit as well. And I'll just gently point out to her about the UN General Assembly. As far as I can tell, looking back at the records, on the vast majority of occasions under the Labour government, it wasn't the Labour Prime Minister that actually attended either.
Matt Warman. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Leaders' Declaration expresses the optimism about AI that I know the Prime Minister and I share. It talks about the importance of international governance and international cooperation. I wonder if he can say how optimistic he is that all the countries at the G20 can sign up to those sorts of principles just as they signed up to the Joint Declaration.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there was a good conversation about AI at the G20 summit, and I am optimistic that most countries are approaching this in a similar way, recognising the tremendous opportunities for growth and opportunity and transforming developments when it comes to healthcare and education in particular, but also cognizant of the challenges and risks that AI poses and are keen to work together to find ways to resolve that. Obviously, we're very early days in countries having this conversation and everyone learning themselves about the potential of the technology. But as I said, I think on this topic, the UK can play a leadership role, and that's what we will do.
Barry Shearman.
Yeah. Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister, many of us were very impressed by the close relationship he obviously has with Prime Minister Modi. But could he tell the House, when he had private time with Prime Minister Modi, did he ask him either of these two questions? First of all, why hasn't he condemned Russia for the invasion of Ukraine? Yeah, that's one question. And the second, did he ask what Modi is doing about the persecution of Muslims and Christians, with their churches and mosques being burnt and people being killed and persecuted? Did he ask him the question about what he's doing to stop all that?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and I discussed a range of issues, and when it comes, as I've said before, on matters of human rights and defending democracy, that's something we talk about with all our international engagement, because those are values that we believe very dearly in.
Edward Lee.
Of course, migration is best dealt with by international cooperation, but it also depends on decisive action at home. 1,500 Indians are entering this country illegally every week. Last year, 600 came across illegally in boats, and this year, that's 600 just in the first 3 months. The Prime Minister told me personally he was going to lead by example by having illegal migrants based at Catterick in his constituency. The MOD were unable this afternoon to give me any date on when they're going to come. Meanwhile, my council has issued a stop notice against the slash and burn tactics of the Home Office at RAF Scampton. The Prime Minister is the head of the government. Will he now instruct Home Office ministers to work proactively with West Lindsay to ensure we get a compromise, we do our bit, we take illegal migrants in a secure location, and we don't rely on decaying bases? We actually take action that will work in the future.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his constructive engagement? I know he will continue to represent his community strongly and is engaged with Home Office ministers on the particular issues in his constituency. But more broadly, I can tell him that we continue to strengthen our cooperation with international partners to combat illegal migration, something I discussed with many of my counterparts at the G20, and will continue to do so through further engagement this autumn, and look to find ways to formalise that cooperation and improve returns agreements. As he mentioned, it's important that we have the ability to return illegal migrants who have come here to countries which are clearly safe places for them to be. We've done that with Albania, and we're strengthening those returns agreements with other countries too.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's disappointing that this G20 statement this year does not name the perpetrator of aggression in Ukraine. What kind of statement is it that G20 leaders feel the need to spin our interpretation of it after the event? Mr. Deputy Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with Canada's Liberal Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who said yesterday that if it were up to him, the language on the war would have been stronger?
Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying, because This is not the G7, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it's not the G1. It's not just for us to take the language that we ourselves would like. Our position on Ukraine is crystal clear for all to see. But the G20 is a collection of a large group of countries which do not all share the same perspective on global affairs or indeed the same values. And to assume that it can reflect the unanimity that we have in the G7 is simply to just misunderstand how foreign affairs actually works. But he asked about what the statement said. Well, yeah, the statement agreed on the significance of securing a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. The statement specifically called for an end to attacks on food and civilian infrastructure, for Russia to rejoin the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and indeed highlighted the suffering that it's causing. It was also a statement that the United States described as containing substantively very strong language on the situation, and that's why to have agreement amongst G20 members, even if not exactly the language we would have chosen, is still a positive outcome from this summit.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to associate myself with the words that the Prime Minister made about Morocco and the people of Morocco. And I'd like to pay tribute to Truro-based Shelterbox, who have a team, as ever, standing ready for deployment at the point that the Moroccan government need it. But my question to the Prime Minister is as follows. Could he tell the House what conversations he's had with his G20 partners with regards to critical mineral extraction and not only to boost local production from Cornwall, from lithium, obviously, but also to ensure we have supply chains that cut out rogue partners?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point about the need for us to improve our economic resilience and security, which is why it is now an increasing feature of the partnership and agreements that we strike around the world. And indeed, it was a feature of the partnership agreement that I struck with Japan when I was there, and indeed the US when I recently visited. I spoke to both President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida about those agreements and the work that we are doing, and in both cases there are milestones for us to meet with regard to strengthen our cooperation on critical minerals in particular.
Andrew Jones.
Deputy Speaker, can I welcome our right honourable friend's statement? He rightly highlighted the importance of international trade and the progress that he's made, including the new partnerships joined. Would he be able to perhaps give a little bit more detail on the progress made on securing an UK-India deal?
Speaker, we do make and have made substantial progress, but as I said, there is hard work left to do, and that's why we'll keep at it. But it's right that we don't put arbitrary deadlines on these trade deals, that we keep going until they work for the British people, for British companies and the British government. That is what we will endeavour to do. As I said, we have made lots of progress, but we won't sign a deal unless it's right for the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on the leadership he played in securing the outcomes of the summit? And further to the response he gave to my honourable friend, does he agree that in view of the scale of the population, the speed of growth in India, the areas of joint expertise and cooperation that have taken place to date, as well as the deep-rooted ties the UK has with India that spread right across the whole of the United Kingdom, can he reassure me that as he progresses the negotiations over the trade deal, that there will be a chapter or elements there that allow for small businesses and medium-sized enterprises across the UK and beyond in order to trade effectively with India?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. India is unquestionably the most, if not the most, one of the most significant and consequential countries for global affairs over the coming years and decades, and it's absolutely right and important that the United Kingdom has a close relationship with India that spans not just economic cooperation but also across areas like defence and security and scientific technology research collaboration. We are looking to try and enhance our partnership in all those areas for the reasons that he mentioned. This is a long-term benefit for the UK if we can get this right.
Jim Sunderland.
Speaker, thank you very much. Members will of course know that the next G20 summit will be held in Rio next November 2024. I note with interest that Brazil has already placed on the agenda something called reform of the global governance institutions. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that reform of the UN Security Council should be considered with the best interest of the UK at heart? Notably, that the UN Security Council remains a viable framework for global security, and that Britain must never put Britain's seat at the table on the table.
Well, Mr.